Tonight, we're diving into the entire story of Gellert Grindelwald, the brilliant and dangerous wizard whose ideas nearly reshaped the wizarding world forever. This is a fascinating topic, but I'll keep my narration calm to ensure you can still drift off to sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now, back to the video. Snow falls softly over the northern towers of a school that few outside its walls have ever seen. Somewhere beyond the pale mountains of northern Europe, in a place where the wind carries the scent of pine and old stone, a young boy walks alone through a corridor lit only by torchlight, his footsteps echoing against walls carved with symbols older than memory. He does not yet know the name history will give him. He does not yet know that the choices waiting ahead of him will one day be spoken of in hushed voices in kitchens and classrooms across the wizarding world, or that a single summer many years from now will change the course of his life forever. For now, he is simply a boy with quick hands, a quicker mind, and a hunger for something more than the ordinary shape of a wizard's life. To understand how that hunger grew into one of the most consequential stories the wizarding world has ever known, we begin not with war, not with fear, but with a childhood, and with a school built for those who wish to master magic without the softness of restraint. And as that lone figure faded into the hush of the corridor ahead, his footsteps swallowed by centuries of frost and stone, it is worth turning back the pages of time to the very beginning, to the place where this long and winding story truly starts, in a chapter we might call A Boy of Extraordinary Gifts. Picture, if you will, a modest wizarding household somewhere in the mountainous reaches of northern Europe, in a year that history has settled upon as 1883. Though the mists of the past have never allowed for perfect certainty, it was into this quiet corner of the magical world that a boy named Gellert Grindelwald first drew breath. His family was neither famous nor especially powerful in the eyes of wizarding society at large, though the name Grindelwald would in time come to echo across the whole of Europe, spoken sometimes in awe and sometimes in sorrow, but never in indifference. The household into which he was born valued learning and old magic, the kind passed down through generations in low voices by firelight, tales of ancient wandlore and half-remembered histories of witches and wizards who had shaped the continent long before any modern ministry had drawn its careful boundaries. It was a home steeped in the sense that magic was old, that it was vast, and that somewhere within its endless folds lay truths still waiting to be uncovered. From his earliest years, it became apparent to those around him that this particular child was unlike other children. Where most young witches and wizards showed only faint, sporadic flashes of accidental magic, the kind that might rattle a window pane or turn a nursery toy a different color, young Gellert's abilities arrived early and arrived strong. Neighbors would later recall, in the hushed and half-embarrassed way people speak of things they cannot quite explain, that objects in his presence seemed to behave with unusual purpose, as though some quiet intelligence guided them rather than mere chance. A candle might steady itself against a draft that should have snuffed it out. A door might ease open at the exact moment his small hand reached toward it, as though the house itself had learned to anticipate him. There was, even then, something in his eyes that unsettled the grown witches and wizards who crossed his path, a keenness that seemed to measure and weigh everything it fell upon, far beyond what any ordinary child might manage. He was, by every account that survives from those years, a boy of restless intellect. Where other children were content to be read simple stories, Gellert wanted to know why the stories were true, and further, whether they might be improved upon. He devoured whatever books he could find, not merely fairy tales of brave witches and cunning goblins, but the older texts, the ones with cracked spines and yellowed pages, the ones that spoke in careful, guarded language about the deeper currents of magic, the kind that most families kept locked away on high shelves. His mind moved quickly, perhaps too quickly for the small village that held him, and those who knew him in his earliest years often used the same word. It was rarely spoken without a second word trailing just behind it, unsettling or perhaps dangerous, though no one could ever quite say why they felt that way about a child so young. There was, even in his boyhood, a hunger in him that seemed to reach past the ordinary boundaries of a wizarding life. Most young witches and wizards of that era grew up content with the promise of a modest position, perhaps in a ministry office, perhaps as a shopkeeper of magical wares, perhaps simply raising a family within the quiet safety of a hidden village. But Gellert seemed, even then, to chafe against the smallness of such a future. He would sit for long stretches at the edge of the forest near his home, watching the wind move through the treetops, and those who observed him during these long, silent hours said he seemed to be listening for something, as though the world itself were whispering a secret meant only for him. He believed, from a very young age, that magic was meant for more than daily conveniences and quiet lives. He believed it was meant to shape the world. Word of the boy's talents did not stay contained within his small community for long. Magical gifts of such intensity rarely go unnoticed, and it was not long before those responsible for identifying promising young witches and wizards across the northern reaches of Europe came to hear of him. The path that lay open to a boy of his considerable ability led, almost inevitably, toward one particular institution, a school whose reputation for rigor and for producing formidable practitioners of magic was known throughout the continent. Durmstrang Institute stood, and still stands, as one of the great pillars of wizarding education, a school shrouded in a certain severe mystique, tucked away in a remote and frost-hardened corner of the world, where its precise location has always been kept, carefully guarded. Unlike some other schools of magic that emphasized balance and gentle nurturing of young talent, Durmstrang was known for something sharper, a tradition that pushed its students toward mastery, toward strength, toward the kind of magical excellence that left little room for hesitation. It was a place that did not simply teach magic, but tested those who came to learn it, shaping them under a demanding hand into witches and wizards capable of standing among the most formidable of their generation. For a boy like Gellert Grindelwald, restless and brilliant, and already straining against the edges of what his small home could offer him, the invitation to Durmstrang must have felt less like an opportunity and more like a door finally swinging open onto the future he had always sensed was waiting for him. Those who knew him in the days before his departure would later describe a boy practically vibrating with anticipation, packing away his books and his few treasured possessions with the calm efficiency of someone who had already, in his mind, left the old life behind. There was little sentiment in his goodbyes, if the old recollections are to be trusted, only a forward-looking certainty that something larger was calling him onward. He was, after all, not a boy inclined to linger on what had already passed. He was a boy always looking toward what came next, toward the horizon, toward the vast unwritten expanse of his own potential. And so, it was that a boy of extraordinary gifts, carrying within him both remarkable promise and a hunger that had not yet found its proper shape, set off toward the north, toward the cold stone halls that would come to define so much of what he would become. He could not have known, as he made that long journey through the deepening snow, just how profoundly that ancient school would sharpen him, nor what kind of companionship and ambition he would find waiting for him within its walls. Up next in Chapter 2, The Halls of Durmstrang, we will uncover how those long frozen corridors and the fellow students who walked them began to forge the boy Gellert Grindelwald into something the wizarding world had never quite seen before. Those long frozen corridors did not take long to make their impression on him, and it is there, within the ancient walls of Durmstrang, that our story now settles, in a chapter we might call The Halls of Durmstrang. The castle that received young Gellert Grindelwald was unlike anything his quiet village upbringing could have prepared him for. Where Hogwarts, far to the west, was said to welcome its students with warm hearths and moving staircases that seemed almost playful in their design, Durmstrang offered something colder and more austere from the very first evening. Its towers rose from the frost like the ribs of some ancient sleeping creature, and its halls were lit not by cheerful floating candles, but by torches that guttered against stone walls thick enough to hold back the harshest of northern winters. The air inside smelled of pine smoke and old parchment, and the older students moved through the corridors with a watchful, measured confidence that Gellert found himself drawn to almost immediately. This was not a school built for comfort, it was a school built for strength. The education offered within those walls reflected the same philosophy. Where other institutions across Europe had, by then, begun drawing careful lines around which forms of magic were fit for young minds and which were better left untouched until adulthood, if ever, Durmstrang held no such tidy boundaries. Its instructors believed, and taught quite openly, that a witch or wizard could not truly master magic without understanding the whole of it, including the darker branches that so many other schools preferred to whisper about rather than explain. Curses were studied here not merely as things to be defended against, but as subjects worthy of genuine academic attention. The restricted sections of other schools' libraries would have seemed, to a Durmstrang student, little more than a modest starting shelf. It was an approach that produced extraordinarily capable witches and wizards, and it was also, many would later reflect, an approach that left very little standing between a gifted student and the temptations such knowledge could offer. For a boy already inclined toward hunger rather than caution, this environment did not discipline his instincts, it fed them. Gellert took to his studies with an intensity that quickly set him apart from his classmates, and this was no small feat in a school already filled with talented and ambitious young people. His professors noted, in the careful language instructors reserve for students who unsettle them even as they impress them, that he possessed an unusually swift grasp of theory, able to absorb in a single evening what took his peers a full term to understand. But it was not simply his speed that marked him. It was where his curiosity kept wandering. While his classmates busied themselves with the practical charms and transfigurations expected of any promising young wizard, Gellert found himself increasingly drawn toward the library's oldest and least visited corners, where texts on the dark arts sat bound in cracked leather, their pages brittle with age and handled by generations of students before him who had, perhaps wisely, chosen not to linger too long over their contents. He lingered. He read late into the night by wandlight, since fallen out of common use, over theories of magical dominance and control that most respectable wizarding families preferred never to discuss at all. He was fascinated less by the destructive potential of such magic, at least at first, and more by the questions it seemed to raise. Questions about power, about who was permitted to wield it, about why certain forms of magic had been locked away rather than simply understood. It seemed to him, even then, an arbitrary kind of caution, one imposed by lesser minds afraid of what they could not master themselves. He did not see himself as one of those lesser minds. He never had. His fellow students noticed, of course. it would have been impossible not to. There is always, in any school, a particular kind of student who draws every eye without seeming to try, and Gellert Grindelwald was exactly that kind of presence at Durmstrang. He was strikingly handsome in a way that seemed almost designed to disarm, with pale hair and an easy, confident bearing that made him appear older than his years. He spoke rarely in class, unless a professor's answer struck him as incomplete, at which point he would offer a correction so precise and so quietly delivered that it left no room for argument. Some of his classmates found him magnetic, drawn to the sense that greatness clung to him the way frost clings to a window pane. Others kept a careful, instinctive distance, sensing something beneath his charm that they could not quite name but did not entirely trust. It was this second impression that began, slowly, to define his reputation within the school. Whispers followed him through the dining hall and along the frozen courtyards, whispers that acknowledged his brilliance while carrying, always, a note of unease. Gifted, the other students would say, echoing the very word his neighbors back home had once used, though here too it rarely traveled alone. Gifted, but strange. Gifted, but dangerous. There were stories, half confirmed and half exaggerated in the way stories always become at a school full of teenagers with too much idle time and too much untested magic at their fingertips, of minor curses tested on unsuspecting classmates in empty corridors, of small cruelties dressed up as academic curiosity. None of it was ever quite substantial enough to bring him before the headmaster. All of it was substantial enough to make people wary. And yet, he was never friendless. Durmstrang was, after all, a place that prized ambition, and ambition recognizes itself easily. A small circle gathered around him over those early years. Other students who found in his ideas something thrilling rather than troubling, who liked the way he spoke of magic not as a tool for daily convenience, but as a force capable of reshaping the world entirely. He held court in quiet corners of the castle, sharing pieces of the forbidden texts he had uncovered, testing his growing theories on the ears of those willing to listen, and watching, always watching, to see which of his classmates might prove useful to him later, and which would simply fade into the ordinary lives that so many wizards seemed content to accept. It was during these formative years, deep in the coldest heart of the school's oldest library, that Gellert first crossed paths with an idea that would come to define the whole of his life, an old and half-forgotten legend tucked away in a volume so obscure that even the librarian seemed surprised anyone had requested it. He did not yet understand, on that first quiet evening of reading, just how completely this discovery would consume him, nor how far it would eventually carry him from the frozen halls that had shaped him. He knew only that something in the old story had reached into him and taken hold, the way certain ideas do when they arrive at exactly the moment a mind is ready to receive them. Up next in Chapter 3, The Symbol in the Seed, we will uncover how a single ancient tale and the dangerous curiosity it awakened in him began to set Gellert Grindelwald on the path that would eventually carry his name across the whole of the wizarding world. A single ancient tale, discovered on a quiet evening in the coldest heart of the Durmstrang library, is where we now turn our attention in a chapter we might call The Symbol and the Seed. The book that had caught young Gellert's eye that night was not, at first glance, especially remarkable. It was slim, its cover worn soft by generations of curious hands, and it sat wedged between far weightier volumes on ancient wand lore that had clearly drawn far more attention over the years. But something about its title made him pause, and once he opened it, he did not close it again until the candle beside him had burned down to little more than a puddle of wax. Within its pages was a story that most wizarding children across Europe had heard in some form or another, usually as a bedtime tale meant to teach a gentle lesson about humility and the dangers of chasing power. The tale of the three brothers. Gellert already knew the surface of the story, as most young wizards did. Three brothers, traveling along a lonely road at twilight, come upon a river too dangerous to cross by ordinary means and conjure a bridge with their combined skill. Death, cheated of the lives that should have been claimed by the river, meets them on the far bank and offers each a prize of his choosing. The eldest asks for a wand more powerful than any in existence, and receives one fashioned from the wood of an elder tree. The second, wishing to humiliate death further, asks for the power to bring back those who have died, and is given a stone capable of summoning the dead. The youngest, wiser, or perhaps simply more cautious than his brothers, asks instead for a means of leaving that place without being followed, and is given a cloak of invisibility woven from death's own cloak. Most children who heard the tale came away with its intended lesson, that greed and pride lead to ruin, that the eldest brother is murdered for his wand, the second is driven to despair by a shade that is not truly his lost love returned, and only the youngest brother, humble in his request, lives a long and peaceful life before greeting death as an old friend at the end of his days. But the version Gellert found that night was different. It was not dressed up as a children's story at all. It was a scholarly treatise written by some long-forgotten researcher of considerable conviction, arguing that the tale was no mere fable, but a coded account of three real and extraordinary objects that had once existed and might exist still, scattered somewhere across the world, waiting to be reunited. The Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, the Cloak of Invisibility. Together, the author argued, these three objects would make their possessor the master of death, itself undefeated and unequaled. The Deathly Hallows. For most readers, even those inclined to believe in such things, the idea would have remained an intriguing curiosity, a pleasant thought experiment to entertain over a winter evening before returning to more practical concerns. For Gellert Grindelwald, it was something else entirely. It struck him with the force of a revelation he had been waiting his whole life to receive, without ever quite knowing what shape that revelation would take. Here, at last, was proof that the old caution he had always resented, the careful, timid boundaries drawn by lesser wizards around the true depths of magic, had kept an entire world from what it might otherwise become. If the Hallows were real, and if they could be found and united, then the old stories of death being cheated were not warnings at all. They were instructions. He began to speak of the Hallows to his small circle of admirers within the school, at first carefully, testing which of them might understand the scale of what he was proposing, and later, with a growing boldness that some found exhilarating and others found faintly alarming. He spoke not merely of possessing the Hallows for personal gain, though the promise of such power certainly appealed to him, but of what a wizard might do once he held such authority openly before the world. He had grown increasingly restless with the secrecy that governed magical life, the endless hiding from the non-magical world, the small, cramped existence so many witches and wizards accepted as simply the price of safety. Why, he began to ask those closest to him, should the gifted hide from the ungifted? Why should wizards, capable of so much, live in the shadows of a world so much weaker than their own? If a wizard held power enough, true and unquestionable power, he might step forward instead of hiding, and rule not through cruelty, but through a strength so evident that resistance would seem foolish. Such rule, he reasoned, would ultimately serve everyone, wizard and non-magical alike, sparing the world the chaos and conflict that fear and secrecy so often bred. He had already begun, In these early formulations, to describe such a vision using a phrase that would follow him for the rest of his life, spoken with the calm certainty of a boy who believed himself entirely reasonable, for the greater good. It was not only theory that consumed him during this period. His fascination with the Hallows and with the deeper, older forms of magic that might help him understand or even locate them pushed him further into experimentation than any of his professors would have sanctioned. He began testing small, dangerous pieces of dark magic on willing and occasionally unwilling classmates alike, framing each incident to himself as necessary research rather than cruelty. A memory altered here, a minor curse tested there, its effects studied with the same detached curiosity a healer might bring to an unusual illness. Those within his circle who had once found his ambition thrilling began, some of them, to grow quietly uneasy, watching their brilliant friend drift further from the boy who had once simply loved ideas and closer to something colder. Something that seemed to view the people around him less as companions and more as instruments useful to a larger design. A few tried gently to pull him back from the direction he seemed to be heading. He did not listen. He rarely did, by that point, to anyone. The masters of Durmstrang, for all their tolerance of the darker branches of magic, were not blind, and reports of strange incidents, of students shaken and altered in ways they could not quite explain, began reaching ears that could no longer be ignored. Gellert Grindelwald had spent years building a reputation as the most gifted student the school had seen in a generation. He was about to discover that even a school as permissive as Durmstrang had its limits, and that he was closer to finding them than he understood. There was, too, a symbol beginning to take shape in his mind during these years, one that would eventually become inseparable from his name across the whole of Wizarding Europe. He had taken to sketching, in the margins of his notes and later on the covers of his private journals, a simple triangular eye traced within a circle, bisected by a single straight line, a mark meant to represent the three Hallows joined as one. It began as a private shorthand, a way of marking pages that touched upon his research into the Hallows without drawing the immediate attention of professors who might have questioned him further. But he found, as the months passed, that he rather liked the symbol's severe, elegant simplicity, the way it seemed to promise a truth hidden just beneath its surface for anyone patient enough to understand it. He began showing it, quietly, to those in his circle who had proven themselves most receptive to his ideas, watching with quiet satisfaction as they too began to see in it the same promise he did, a sign that something larger than any of them was beginning to take shape. His closest companions during this period, a handful of students drawn from wealthy and influential wizarding families scattered across the continent, found themselves swept along by the sheer force of his conviction. He spoke to them late at night in the unused corners of the castle, laying out his vision with the patient, methodical clarity of a young man already accustomed to being listened to. He did not present his ideas as rebellion for its own sake, nor as simple hunger for power, though both were certainly present beneath the surface of what he said. He framed them instead as inevitability, as though he were merely the first among his generation clear-sighted enough to name what history itself was already moving toward. Wizardkind, he told them, could no longer afford to hide. The non-magical world was growing in number and in a certain reckless, unregulated strength of its own, and sooner or later, he argued, a reckoning between the two would come, whether wizards prepared for it or not. Better, he said, that such a reckoning be shaped by those wise enough to guide it gently, than left to chance and fear. It was a seductive argument, wrapped as it was in the language of protection and progress rather than conquest, and it was one that would follow him, refined and repeated for decades to come. In Chapter 4, Expulsion, we will uncover the incident that finally severed his place within those frozen halls, and the long, uncertain road that followed him away from the only school he had ever known. The incident that finally severed his place within those frozen halls did not arrive without warning. Though few at the time understood just how close its shadow had already crept, and it is there that we now arrive, in a chapter we might call expulsion. By his later years at Durmstrang, Gellert Grindelwald had become something of a paradox within the school's ancient walls. To the faculty who graded his work, he remained the most naturally gifted student many of them had ever taught. Capable of magic well beyond his years, the kind of pupil whose name they expected to hear again, someday spoken with pride from wherever he eventually settled. But to a growing number of his classmates, and increasingly to the more observant among the staff, he had also become something else, a source of quiet unease that seemed to deepen with each passing term. His experiments, once confined to whispered rumor and second-hand accounts too vague to act upon, had grown bolder, and bolder experiments leave behind evidence that even a school built on strength and self-reliance could not simply overlook forever. The details of what finally brought matters to a head have never been fully agreed upon, even among those who study his life most closely, and this is perhaps fitting for a figure whose whole story seems wrapped in half-told truths and careful omissions. What is generally accepted is this: in pursuit of his growing fascination with the darker edges of magical theory, drawn ever onward by his conviction that true mastery required understanding what others feared to touch, Gellert conducted a series of dangerous magical experiments directly upon several of his fellow students. Whether these students had volunteered out of loyalty to him, or whether they had simply found themselves unable to refuse a young man whose presence had always carried an undertone of quiet command, the results were serious enough that they could no longer be dismissed as schoolyard rumor. One experiment, more severe than the others, left a classmate injured badly enough that the matter finally reached the desk of the headmaster himself, and this time no amount of brilliance could shield Gellert from the consequences of what he had done. The headmaster of Durmstrang, a man who had tolerated a great deal in the name of producing formidable witches and wizards, found in this incident a line even he was unwilling to let stand uncrossed. Gellert was summoned, the full account was laid before him, and whatever defense he offered, and by most accounts he offered one with the same calm, persuasive confidence that had carried him through every challenge before this one, it was not enough. The decision was made swiftly and without further debate. Gellert Grindelwald, the most talented student the school had seen in a generation, was expelled from Durmstrang Institute. It is worth pausing here to consider what such a moment must have meant to a young man who had built so much of his sense of self upon his own exceptional gifts. For most students, expulsion from a school of Durmstrang's standing would have meant catastrophe, a mark that would follow them through every future attempt to build a life in the wizarding world. For Gellert, by every account that survives, it seemed to register less as a defeat and more as an inconvenience, an obstacle imposed by minds too small to appreciate what he had been reaching toward. He gathered his few belongings from the dormitory that had housed him for so many winters, said what farewells he judged worth saying to the small circle who had remained loyal to him despite everything, and departed the frozen towers that had shaped him without, if the old accounts are to be believed, a single visible flicker of regret. What followed was a period of his life that remains, even now, only loosely documented, a stretch of years spent wandering across the European continent with neither school nor settled home to anchor him. He traveled through lands both familiar and strange to him, staying briefly in the company of distant acquaintances of his family, or simply moving from town to town as his curiosity and his dwindling resources allowed. It was, by all appearances, a restless and searching period, the kind of wandering that so often follows a sudden and unwelcome ending, when a young person finds themselves needing to discover who they might become once the path they had always assumed for themselves has closed behind them. He continued, wherever he traveled, to pursue the questions that Durmstrang's library had first planted in him, seeking out obscure texts in the private collections of families willing to host him, listening carefully to old stories told by innkeepers and traveling merchants, who sometimes knew, without fully realizing it, fragments of magical history worth far more than they understood. It was during this long season of wandering that fate, or perhaps simple family obligation, finally steered him toward a quiet corner of England that would prove far more significant to his story than any of the grand cities or ancient libraries he had passed through before it. Gellert had, on his mother's side, a great aunt, an elderly and well-respected witch by the name of Bathilda Bagshot, a woman whose scholarly reputation extended well beyond the borders of the small village she called home. She had, over the years, written to his family from time to time, and word eventually reached Gellert, wherever his travels had carried him, that his great-aunt would be glad to host him for a time, provided he wished to cross the channel and settle for a season in the peaceful English countryside. Whatever his private reasons, whether it was simple practicality, a need for shelter after so much aimless travel, or a quieter curiosity about the aunt whose letters had always carried a certain scholarly warmth, Gellert accepted the invitation. And so, sometime in his late teenage years, the young man who had once seemed destined to be remembered as Durmstrang's finest student, and who was now remembered instead as one of its most notorious failures, packed what few belongings had survived his years of wandering and made his way toward a small and unremarkable village in the English countryside, a place called Godric's Hollow, where his great-aunt Bathilda Bagshot kept a quiet cottage and where, though he could not possibly have known it as he approached down the lane for the first time, the whole direction of his life was about to change again. Up next, in Chapter 5, The Cottage at Godric's Hollow, we will uncover what waited for him in that sleepy village and the modest, unassuming beginnings of a meeting that would echo through the whole of wizarding history. What waited for him in that sleepy village, unassuming as it must have first appeared, deserves its own careful telling, and so we arrive now in a chapter we might call The Cottage at Godric's Hollow. The summer of 1899 settled gently over the English countryside in the way summers there so often do, warm and unhurried, the kind of season that seems to slow the passage of time itself. Godric's Hollow, the village toward which young Gellert Grindelwald now made his way, was a small and largely unremarkable place by any ordinary measure. A scattering of cottages and a modest square gathered around an old stone church, its graveyard filled with names that stretched back centuries into the region's history. It was the sort of village a traveler might pass through without a second glance, were it not for the fact that a considerable number of its residents happened to be witches and wizards, living quietly alongside their non-magical neighbors in the easy, unremarked way that only a very old and settled magical community can manage. Here, magic was not hidden behind grand walls or elaborate secrecy. It simply existed, folded into the rhythm of daily life, present in the smoke that curled just slightly too neatly from certain chimneys, in the gardens that bloomed a little too vividly for the season. At the edge of this village stood the cottage of Bathilda Bagshot, a modest but comfortable home surrounded by an overgrown garden that spoke of a mind more interested in books than in horticulture. Bathilda herself was, by that point in her long life, a figure of considerable standing within the wizarding world, a historian whose careful and thorough writings on magical history had earned her real respect among scholars across Britain and beyond. She was a woman of warm curiosity and gentle eccentricity, the sort of great aunt who kept her home filled with towering stacks of books and half-finished research, who welcomed her young great-nephew with genuine affection and very little fuss, offering him a spare room, a place at her table, and the quiet freedom to spend his days as he saw fit while he decided what direction his life might take next. For Gellert, freshly expelled and still finding his footing after so many months of aimless travel, the cottage offered something he had not realized he needed: a settled place to rest, however temporarily, and an audience in his great-aunt who was more than willing to indulge his endless questions about magical history, wand lore, and the older, half-forgotten corners of wizarding scholarship that so many others found tedious. Bathilda, delighted to find a young relative who shared her passion for such subjects, spent many long afternoons in conversation with him, unaware that some of the questions he posed so casually carried a far more particular hunger behind them than simple scholarly curiosity. It was through these quiet village days that Gellert first became aware of a family living not far from his great-aunt's cottage, a family whose name was already spoken with a certain sympathetic gentleness by the other residents of Godric's Hollow. The Dumbledores had settled in the village some time before, following circumstances that most locals understood only in vague, respectful outline, the kind of understanding a small community extends to a family it senses has already suffered enough without needing its business picked over by curious neighbors. The father of the family was no longer present, having been sent to Azkaban years earlier following an incident involving a group of Muggle boys and a terrible attack upon his youngest daughter, an event the family rarely spoke of and the village had long since learned not to ask about. The mother had since passed as well, leaving her 3 children to manage largely on their own, bound together by grief and by the quiet, careful routines that had grown up around protecting the youngest of them. The eldest of the Dumbledore children was a young man named Albus, whose reputation had, even by that point, begun to precede him well beyond the borders of the small village. He had completed his education at Hogwarts with an academic record so extraordinary that it was still spoken of by his former professors, a young wizard whose gifts seemed to rival, and some whispered exceed, any student that storied school had produced in living memory. He had returned to Godric's Hollow not by ambition, but by necessity, setting aside for the time being the grander opportunities that surely awaited a mind like his in order to care for his younger siblings following the death of their mother. It was a duty he carried, by all accounts, with quiet resignation rather than resentment, though those who knew him best sometimes sensed a restlessness beneath his composed exterior, the feeling of a brilliant young man whose true path had been paused rather than abandoned. His younger brother, Aberforth, was a study in contrast, less concerned with books and grand theories than with the practical, steady work of keeping a household running and watching over his fragile younger sister with a fierce and unwavering protectiveness. And that younger sister, Ariana, was rarely seen by the village at all. She lived a sheltered, closely guarded existence within the walls of the Dumbledore home, her magic having become unpredictable and difficult to control in the aftermath of the trauma that had marked her childhood, a condition her family worked hard and quietly to shield from the curious eyes of neighbors who understood only that something painful had happened to her and that it was not their place to ask further. It was a household, in short, carrying far more weight and sorrow behind its modest walls than the peaceful village around it might have suggested. And it existed now only a short walk from the cottage where Gellert Grindelwald had recently arrived, restless, brilliant, and searching, whether he yet knew it or not, for exactly the kind of mind that could match his own. He had heard Albus Dumbledore's name spoken with real admiration during his own great-aunt's stories of wizarding scholarship, and something in the description of this other young man, gifted, ambitious, and quietly constrained by circumstances beyond his control, had already begun to stir a familiar curiosity in him. Up next in Chapter 6, Two Brilliant Minds, we will uncover the moment these two remarkable young men finally crossed paths, and the extraordinary, fateful friendship that began to take shape between them almost from their very first conversation. It did not take long, in a village as small as Godric's Hollow, for two young men of such singular brilliance to cross paths. And history would come to know that meeting as the beginning of a chapter we might call Two Brilliant Minds. The wizarding community tucked into that quiet corner of England was not large, and word traveled quickly along its narrow lanes and low stone walls. It was inevitable that the arrival of Bathilda Bagshot's great-nephew, a striking young man freshly departed from the famed halls of Durmstrang, would reach the ears of the Dumbledore household before too many days had passed. Bathilda herself, ever fond of connecting bright minds, made the introduction with the easy warmth of a woman who suspected she was doing something rather significant, though she could not have guessed how significant it would truly become. She brought young Albus Dumbledore to her cottage one drowsy afternoon, ostensibly so that the two clever boys of the village might exchange the kind of scholarly conversation neither could easily find elsewhere. And from the very first exchange of words, something unmistakable passed between them. Albus Dumbledore was, at that time, a young man already carrying a formidable reputation of his own. He had left Hogwarts with a record of achievement that seemed almost to embarrass the very notion of ordinary academic success. A young wizard whose name had already begun to circulate in learned circles for his contributions to magical theory. He had, by all accounts, a mind built for expansion, forever reaching past the boundary of what was already known and pressing into the unmapped territory beyond it. In Gellert Grindelwald, he found, for what may have been the first time in his life, an equal. Here was someone who did not merely listen to his ideas with polite admiration, as so many others had done, but who met them, matched them, and often extended them further than Albus himself had dared to imagine. Their first conversation, as later recollections would describe it, stretched long past what either of them had intended, the afternoon light fading into evening without either young man taking notice. They spoke of transfiguration and its outer limits, of the philosophical questions buried inside even the simplest of spells, of ancient magical theory that most wizards their age had never troubled themselves to study. And beneath all of it ran a shared restlessness, a sense that the wizarding world as it stood was smaller than it ought to be, hemmed in by caution and by the slow, careful thinking of older generations. Both young men, in their own ways, hungered for something larger. From that first afternoon onward, the two became near constant companions. Grindelwald, staying in Bathilda's cottage at the edge of the village, found himself with an abundance of unstructured time, and Albus, whose days were nominally occupied with the care of his fragile sister, Ariana, and the quiet running of the family home, began finding reasons to slip away in the evenings to meet his new friend. Bathilda's garden became a frequent meeting place, its hedges and worn stone bench serving as backdrop to conversations that stretched deep into the summer nights. Villagers who passed the cottage after dark would sometimes see a single candle still burning in an upstairs window, long after the rest of Godric's Hollow had gone to sleep. And here, if the night was still enough, the low murmur of voices trading ideas back and forth like a game neither wished to end. There was an intensity to the friendship that those who witnessed it from the outside found difficult to fully describe. It was not merely intellectual, though the intellectual connection between them was, by any measure, extraordinary. Two young men of comparable genius rarely encounter one another in the whole of their lives, let alone in a sleepy English village where such brilliance seemed entirely out of place. But it was also something more personal, more urgent. Albus, who had spent years quietly shouldering responsibilities well beyond his age, found in Grindelwald a kind of release, a companion who did not ask him to be careful or dutiful, but who instead invited him to imagine, to dream, to consider possibilities he had never allowed himself to fully entertain. And Grindelwald, restless and newly expelled from the only institution that had ever properly challenged him, found in Albus a mind capable of keeping pace with his own racing thoughts, and perhaps, for the first time, a friend who did not regard his intensity as something to be feared. They would talk for hours about the history of magic, about theories long dismissed by mainstream scholarship, about the uneven and often uneasy relationship between the wizarding world and the Muggles who lived alongside it without ever fully perceiving it. Albus, who possessed a scholar's patience alongside his brilliance, would often temper Grindelwald's more sweeping pronouncements with careful nuance, though those who knew him later in life would reflect that even his nuance seemed, in those particular months, to bend more readily toward his new friend's convictions than it might once have done. There was a kind of gravitational pull to Grindelwald's certainty, a charisma that made his sweeping visions of the future feel not reckless but inevitable, not dangerous but visionary. It has been said, by those who study this period of Dumbledore's life with the greatest care, that Albus had never before encountered anyone who made him feel quite so understood. His own family life, marked by grief and by the quiet, unspoken tragedy surrounding his sister, had left him isolated in ways that few around him fully grasped. His father was gone, taken from the family under circumstances the village still murmured about in careful undertones. His mother had died only that same year, leaving Albus, though still young himself, as the head of a household burdened with more sorrow than any young man should have to carry alone. Into that quiet weight of duty and grief walked Gellert Grindelwald, luminous and certain and utterly unafraid of the future, and it is little wonder that Albus found himself drawn toward him with a force that felt, at the time, like the answer to a question he had not even known he was asking. Long into those warm summer nights, the two spoke not only of magical theory, but of the shape of the world itself, of the tired old boundaries that kept wizardkind hidden and diminished, of the vast unrealized potential that lay dormant in a magical community too cautious to claim its rightful place. These were, at first, merely the musings of clever young men testing the edges of their own imagination, the kind of grand and sweeping talk that intelligent youths often indulge in the quiet hours when the rest of the world has gone to sleep. But beneath the surface of those conversations, something else was beginning to take shape, an idea neither of them could yet fully name, though it was already, in those early nights in Bathilda's garden, beginning to put down roots. Neither young man could have known, as they sat beneath the summer stars trading theories and dreams, how far that idea would eventually carry them, nor what it would ultimately cost. Up next in Chapter 7, For the Greater Good, we will uncover how those late-night conversations between two brilliant and restless minds slowly hardened into a shared vision, one that would set them both upon a path from which neither would easily return. Those late-night conversations between two brilliant and restless minds did not remain idle musing for long, and what follows is the chapter history has come to call For the Greater Good. As the summer of 1899 deepened, the friendship between Albus Dumbledore and Gellert Grindelwald moved beyond shared theory and late-evening companionship into something with sharper edges and a clearer shape. It began, as such things often do, with a story. Grindelwald had long been fascinated by an old wizarding tale, one most in the magical world dismissed as a charming fable meant for children. The legend of three brothers who were said to have cheated death itself and received from it three extraordinary objects: an unbeatable wand, a stone with power over the dead, and a cloak of true invisibility. Where most wizards heard this story and thought only of a pleasant bedtime tale, Grindelwald heard something else entirely. He had come to believe, through years of study at Durmstrang and through his own restless digging into forbidden and half-forgotten texts, that the objects described in that but real, and that they were waiting somewhere to be found by a wizard clever and determined enough to seek them out. Albus, whose own scholarship was formidable and whose curiosity had never once shied from difficult or unconventional ideas, found himself drawn into this pursuit with an eagerness that surprised even him. Together, the two young men spent long hours poring over Bathilda's considerable library, cross-referencing old wand lore with obscure historical accounts, tracing the scattered footprints of a legend that most of the wizarding world had long since dismissed. It was not merely the thrill of the hunt that captivated them, though that thrill was real enough. It was what possession of such objects might mean, what doors they might open, what old and tired limitations they might finally allow two brilliant young men to overcome. From this shared fascination with the Deathly Hallows grew something larger still, an idea that the two of them began, in hushed and increasingly urgent tones, to call the greater good. It began as a simple enough proposition between them, that wizardkind, gifted with abilities so far beyond those of ordinary muggles, had for too long hidden itself away out of fear and caution, when in truth it ought to be wizardkind's place to guide the world rather than conceal itself from it. Grindelwald spoke with the persuasive fire that had always characterized him, of a future in which witches and wizards no longer lived in secrecy and shame, but stepped into their rightful position, ruling not through cruelty, as he was always careful to frame it, but through wisdom, benevolence, and the kind of order that only those with true power could provide. It was not domination he claimed to seek, but stewardship, the guiding hand of the capable extended over the incapable, all of it, as the two of them repeated to one another again and again in the quiet hours, for the greater good. Albus, brilliant and grieving and burdened by a home life that felt increasingly like a cage around his own considerable potential, found in this vision something that answered a need he had not known he carried. Here, at last, was a purpose vast enough to match his own extraordinary gifts, a plan that made sense of the frustration he had long felt at watching a magical world content to hide itself away rather than claim the greatness it was capable of. The two of them began exchanging letters even on the days they saw one another in person, as though their spoken conversations could not contain the full scope of what they were imagining, and needed instead to be set down in ink, made permanent, made real. Those letters, preserved in fragments that would only surface many years later, revealed two young men swept up entirely in their own brilliance and their own certainty. They wrote to one another of authority being displayed rather than exercised through brute force, believing that once wizardkind stood openly before the Muggle world, that world would simply accept the natural and inevitable order of things. They reasoned that whatever resistance arose along the way, whatever minor and regrettable use of force became necessary, could be justified entirely by the peace and prosperity that would follow. It was Albus, in fact, who first gave voice to the very phrase that would come to define their shared ambition, suggesting that any power they gained and any hardship that power required along the way would be entirely validated by its outcome, for the greater good of wizards and muggles alike. Grindelwald received the idea eagerly and made it his own, weaving it into the foundation of everything he would go on to build. Their plans grew bolder with each passing week. They spoke of gathering the Deathly Hallows not merely as curious historical artifacts, but as instruments of their new vision, the Elder Wand to grant them unmatched power in any conflict that might arise. The Resurrection Stone perhaps to draw upon the wisdom of the dead, the Cloak to move unseen and unchallenged wherever necessary. It was a plan built on the particular arrogance of the young and the brilliant. The conviction that intelligence alone was sufficient justification for authority, and that the world, once shown a better way, would surely follow without much resistance. Neither young man, caught up as they were in the intoxicating rush of shared genius and shared purpose, paused to consider how such a vision might unravel, nor whose lives might be caught in the unraveling. It is worth remembering, as this part of the story unfolds, that Albus Dumbledore was not yet the wise and cautious figure that later generations of witches and wizards would come to know and trust. He was young, brilliant, grieving, and for the first time in his adult life, entirely captivated by another mind that seemed to see the world exactly as he did. Grindelwald, for his part, possessed a gift for making even the most sweeping and dangerous ideas sound like simple common sense, the natural conclusion of any sufficiently intelligent line of reasoning. Together, in the golden light of that English summer, the two of them built, letter by letter and conversation by conversation, the outline of a world neither of them yet understood the true cost of remaking. But even as their ambitions grew larger and their plans more elaborate, storm clouds were beginning to gather far closer to home than either young man cared to notice. Up next in Chapter 8, Cracks Beneath the Surface, we will uncover how the widening distance between Albus's grand new ambitions and the quiet, fragile needs of his own family began to strain the bonds holding Godric's Hollow together. The widening distance between Albus's grand new ambitions and the quiet, fragile needs of his own family did not stay hidden for long. And this part of the story is best remembered as Cracks Beneath the Surface. While Albus spent his days and increasingly his nights absorbed in theory and correspondence with his new companion, the ordinary responsibilities of the Dumbledore household had not paused to wait for him. Ariana, his younger sister, remained in the same fragile and closely guarded condition that had shaped the family's quiet, careful existence for years. Ever since the trauma she had suffered as a small child, an assault by a group of cruel Muggle boys who had glimpsed her practicing magic and could not comprehend what they had seen, Ariana's own magic had turned unpredictable and, at times, dangerous, both to herself and to those nearest her. She required constant, patient care, the kind of steady watchfulness that left little room for distraction. For years, it had fallen to Aberforth, and in his absence, to Albus, to provide that watchfulness, to keep the household calm, to keep Ariana safe from a world that had already once proven itself capable of terrible cruelty toward her. It was Aberforth who first began to notice and to resent how thoroughly his older brother's attention had drifted elsewhere. Aberforth had never possessed his brother's dazzling academic brilliance, nor had he ever particularly wanted it. And, in their own way, deeper, rooted entirely in the well-being of his sister and the fragile peace of their home. He had little patience for abstract talk of wizarding destiny or the philosophical merits of power exercised for some greater good. What he saw, plainly and with growing frustration, was his brother spending long hours away from a house that needed him, returning late with his eyes bright and his mind clearly elsewhere, offering only distracted replies when asked how Ariana had fared that day. The tension between the brothers grew slowly at first, the kind of friction that reveals itself in small moments rather than sudden confrontations. A missed mealtime, A question about Ariana's care answered too quickly, too carelessly. An evening when Aberforth found himself alone again with his sister, while Albus remained at Bathilda's cottage long after the sun had gone down, lost in conversation and correspondence with Grindelwald. Aberforth said little at first, choosing instead to simply absorb the growing weight of responsibility that his brother seemed, more and more, content to set aside. But the silence between them grew heavier with each passing week, thick with things neither brother was yet willing to say aloud. What worried Aberforth most, and what he found hardest to put into words even to himself, was not simply his brother's absence, but the change he sensed taking shape within Albus during the rare hours he was present. There was an intensity to him now, a kind of restless excitement Aberforth did not recognize and did not trust. Albus spoke, when he spoke at all of his time with Grindelwald, in sweeping terms Aberforth found difficult to follow and even more difficult to accept. Talk of wizardkind's rightful place in the world, of power used wisely rather than hidden away, of a future so much larger than the quiet, careful life their family had always known. To Aberforth, whose entire understanding of responsibility had been shaped by years of protecting a sister who needed protecting above all else, such talk sounded less like vision and more like a dangerous kind of vanity, the sort of thinking that placed grand abstractions above the people standing directly in front of you. He tried, on more than one occasion, to raise his concerns with his brother, though the attempts rarely went well. Albus, still caught in the bright and consuming pull of his friendship with Grindelwald, found Aberforth's worries small in comparison to the scope of what he and his companion were building together in their minds. He would offer reassurances, promise to spend more time at home, and then, within days, find himself once again drawn back to Bathilda's cottage, back to conversations that felt, in the moment, more urgent and more alive than anything waiting for him within his own walls. It was not that Albus had stopped loving his sister or ceased to care for her well-being. It was, rather, that he had discovered, for the first time in a life defined by duty and grief, a companionship that made him feel fully seen, fully matched, fully himself, and it proved a difficult thing to set aside even for the sake of the family he loved. Bathilda Bagshot, for her part, watched the growing closeness between the two young men with a kind of proud fondness, entirely unaware of the darker shape their ideas had begun to take, or of the strain quietly building within the Dumbledore household just down the lane. She saw only two gifted young minds finding one another in an unlikely village, and took a grandmotherly delight in having, however unwittingly, brought them together. She had no reason to suspect that the letters passing between her great-nephew and young Albus carried within them the seeds of something far more consequential than academic enthusiasm. Ariana, meanwhile, existed at the quiet center of all this mounting tension, largely unaware of the growing friction her condition indirectly caused between her brothers. Her days remained small and careful, shaped by the same gentle routines that had sustained her for years. Walks in the garden when her moods allowed it, quiet hours indoors when they did not. The constant, unspoken vigilance of whichever brother happened to be present. She loved Albus, and she had grown fond, in her own quiet way, of hearing about his clever new friend. Though she understood little of the grand ideas, the two of them debated late into the night. She could not have known how closely her own fragile safety was tied to the widening distance opening between her brothers, nor how soon that distance would prove impossible to ignore. By the final weeks of that summer, the strain within the household had grown into something neither brother could pretend away much longer. Aberforth's frustration had hardened into something closer to open resentment, and Albus, though he would not yet admit it fully to himself, had begun to sense that the life he was building in his mind with Grindelwald and the life waiting for him inside his own front door had grown difficult to hold together at once. Up next, in Chapter 9, The Duel in the Garden, we will uncover how that mounting tension finally broke and what unbearable cost the Dumbledore family would pay for it. That mounting tension within the Dumbledore household finally broke on an ordinary afternoon in that same fateful summer, in the chapter that has come to be remembered with quiet sorrow as The Duel in the Garden. By the time the confrontation arrived, the strain between the brothers had reached a point where restraint was no longer possible. Aberforth, who had spent weeks watching his older brother drift further into his friendship with Grindelwald, while the daily burden of caring for Ariana fell ever more heavily upon his own shoulders, could no longer keep his frustration contained. On that particular day, accounts suggest he arrived at Bathilda's cottage, or perhaps encountered the two young men in the garden nearby, determined finally to say aloud everything he had been holding back for weeks. He wanted his brother home. He wanted the endless talk of grand futures and wizarding destiny to end. He wanted, more than anything, for Albus to remember that he had a sister who needed him, here, in the present, rather than in whatever distant and glittering future he and his companion had spent the summer imagining together. What began as a heated exchange of words between the two brothers did not stay contained to words for long. Grindelwald, present for the confrontation and unwilling to stand aside while his vision, and by extension his friendship with Albus, came under attack, inserted himself into the argument, and his presence only sharpened the tension rather than easing it. Aberforth, already burning with weeks of suppressed frustration, turned his anger toward Grindelwald as much as toward his own brother, and it was in this moment, three young men caught in a swirl of grief, loyalty, ambition, and exhaustion, that wands were drawn. What followed unfolded quickly, in the disordered and chaotic way that real moments of crisis so often do. Quite unlike the neat and deliberate duels of legend, spells crossed the small garden in rapid succession, none of the three young men fully in command of the moment, each acting more from raw emotion than from any clear intention. It was not a battle fought with careful strategy or cold precision, but something far messier. Three people who cared for one another in their own complicated ways, suddenly swept into a storm none of them had intended to create. And then, in the midst of that swirling confusion, tragedy arrived, swift and irreversible. Ariana, drawn by the noise, or perhaps simply present nearby as she so often was, found herself caught within the crossfire of that brief and chaotic duel. A curse, loosed from one of the three wands in the heat of the moment, found her, and in an instant, the fragile young woman who had spent years shielded so carefully from the world's cruelty was gone. To this day, no one has ever been able to say with certainty which wand released the curse that took her life. Albus himself would spend the rest of his years unable to say for certain whether the fault lay with his own hand, with his brother's, or with Grindelwald's, and it was a question that would follow him, unanswered and unanswerable, for the whole of his long life. The garden fell silent in the way that only true tragedy can silence a place, the echoes of shouted spells giving way all at once to a stillness that felt unbearable in its completeness. For a long moment, none of the three young men could move, each caught in the same disbelieving horror, the same desperate hope that what had just happened might somehow be undone if only they refused to accept it. But magic, for all its wonders, has never held power over death, and no spell existed that could call Ariana back from where she had gone. Bathilda, alerted by the commotion, arrived to find a scene of devastation that would remain with her for the rest of her days. Three young men frozen in grief and shock, and Ariana still and silent upon the garden ground. The aftermath that followed was quiet in the way that only the deepest grief can be quiet. None of the sharp accusations or raised voices that might have been expected, but instead a kind of numb and hollow disbelief that settled over the cottage and everyone within it. Aberforth's fury, so fiercely present only moments before, dissolved into something far more painful, a grief tangled hopelessly with guilt, for he could never be entirely certain his own spell had not been the one responsible. Albus, who had spent the whole of that summer reaching toward a brighter and larger future, found himself instead confronted with the smallest and most devastating truth imaginable, that in his reaching he had lost sight of the sister he had sworn for years to protect. Grindelwald's response to the tragedy would become, in later years, one of the most quietly damning details of the entire episode. Where Aberforth and Albus were consumed by grief too large for words, Grindelwald's instinct, even in that terrible moment, turned towards self-preservation. He understood, with the same swift clarity that had always characterized his thinking, precisely what the death of a young witch under such circumstances might mean for him. A young man already carrying the weight of expulsion from Durmstrang and a reputation for dangerous magical experimentation. Whatever grief he may have genuinely felt in that moment, and history has never been able to say for certain how much he felt, it did not linger long enough to root him to that garden. The village of Godric's Hollow, so quiet and unremarkable only days before, would never again be the same for the family at its heart. What had begun as a summer of extraordinary friendship, brilliant conversation, and boundless shared ambition had ended instead in a loss so profound that no amount of genius or vision could ever undo it. The three young men who had stood together in that garden would carry the weight of that afternoon for the rest of their lives, each in his own private and unshareable way. In the hours that followed, as the first raw wave of grief began to ebb into something colder and more desperate, one final decision remained to be made, a decision that would determine everything that came after. Up next in Chapter 10, The Parting of Ways, we will uncover how Gellert Grindelwald chose, in the shadow of that unbearable loss, to leave Godric's Hollow behind, and what that departure would mean for the friendship he left shattered in his wake. In the shadow of that unbearable loss, one final decision remained to be made, and it belongs to the chapter we now call The Parting of Ways. In the days that followed Ariana's death, Godric's Hollow settled into a grief so heavy it seemed to press upon the very stones of the village. Bathilda Bagshot, still shaken by what she had witnessed in her own garden, moved through those days in a fog of sorrow and disbelief, struggling to reconcile the two brilliant young men she had so proudly introduced only weeks earlier with the devastation that had followed in the wake of their friendship. The Dumbledore household, already accustomed to grief after the loss of both parents in earlier years, now found itself facing a sorrow deeper than any it had known before, the loss of the very sister the family had spent so many years working so carefully to protect. Gellert Grindelwald did not remain in Godric's Hollow long enough to see that grief settle into anything resembling peace. Within a remarkably short span of time, days by most accounts, he made the decision to leave the village entirely, and with it to leave behind the friendship that had so recently felt like the truest connection of his young life. His departure was quiet and largely unannounced, the kind of leaving that spoke less of careful planning and more of a young man running from something he could not bear to face. He offered little in the way of explanation to Bathilda, and even less to Albus, who by every account was left to absorb the departure, much as he had been left to absorb everything else in those unbearable days, largely alone. It is worth pausing here to consider what such a departure reveals about the young man Grindelwald was, and about the young man he was already becoming. Whatever affection he had genuinely held for Albus during their summer of shared brilliance and shared ambition and there is little reason to doubt that the connection between them had been real. It proved, in the end, insufficient to hold him in place once real consequences arrived at his doorstep. Grindelwald had always possessed an instinct for self-preservation sharper than his instinct for loyalty, and in the aftermath of Ariana's death, that instinct guided him firmly away from Godric's Hollow and toward the wider continent, where his past could be more easily left behind and his future more easily reshaped on his own terms. For Albus, the departure landed as a second devastating loss layered directly atop the first. He had lost his sister in that terrible confusion in the garden, and now, within days, he found himself losing the friend who had, for one brief and luminous summer, made him feel more fully understood than he had ever felt before. There was no proper farewell between them, no final conversation in which the two young men might have addressed what had happened, what it meant, or what, if anything, still remained of the bond they had built. Grindelwald simply was gone, leaving Albus alone with a grief too large and too complicated for words, tangled hopelessly together with guilt, confusion, and the unbearable knowledge that he might never know for certain which of the three wands in that garden had struck the fatal blow. The weeks that followed saw Albus retreat inward in a manner that those who had known him before that summer found almost unrecognizable. The brilliant young wizard whose academic accomplishments had once seemed boundless, whose future had appeared destined for greatness on the largest possible stage, withdrew instead into the narrow, quiet confines of Godric's Hollow, and into a private grief he shared with almost no one. He took up the daily care of the household that remained, tending to what family duties still existed in the aftermath of tragedy, and in doing so seemed to be attempting, in whatever small way he could, to make amends for a summer during which he had let those very duties slip so far from his attention. Aberforth, for his part, could not easily forgive his brother, not fully, not for a long time. The wound between them ran deep, tangled with unanswerable questions about whose curse had truly struck Ariana, questions neither brother would ever be able to resolve with any certainty. What had once been a difficult but functional relationship between two brothers bound together by shared responsibility became, in the wake of that afternoon, something far more fractured, weighted with a grief neither of them could fully voice to the other. The closeness they might once have rebuilt in ordinary circumstances now had to contend with a tragedy that sat permanently between them, unspoken and unresolved. Albus, meanwhile, carried a private torment that went beyond even his grief for Ariana and his estrangement from Aberforth. Somewhere beneath the surface of his sorrow lived an uncomfortable and persistent question about his own culpability, not merely in the moment of the duel itself, but in the entire summer that had led to it. He could not escape the knowledge that his own dazzling ambitions, his own hunger for a companionship, and a purpose larger than his ordinary life had drawn his attention away from the sister who had needed him most. The grand visions he and Grindelwald had spun together through those long summer nights, of wizardkind's rightful power and the greater good it might serve, now felt to him not like the brilliant philosophy he had once believed them to be, but like a dangerous indulgence that had cost him the one thing he could never recover. In the months and years that followed, Albus Dumbledore turned away from the wider ambitions that had once seemed to call so brightly to him. He did not pursue the grand political or magical career that his early brilliance had once seemed to promise. Instead, he remained largely within the quiet borders of the wizarding world he knew, teaching, studying, and carrying, silently, the weight of a summer he rarely spoke of to anyone. The friendship that had once burned so brightly between two brilliant minds had ended not in betrayal exactly, and not in open enmity, but in something perhaps harder to bear, a sorrow so complete that neither young man could bring himself to reach back across it. And as Albus withdrew into the quiet careful life he would maintain for years to come. Gellert Grindelwald was already moving briskly onward across the continent, carrying with him the very ideas the two of them had built together, though now entirely his own to shape. Up next in Chapter 11, Vanishing into the Continent, we will uncover where Grindelwald's flight from Godric's Hollow led him, and how the brilliant, wounded young man who vanished that summer began the long transformation into the figure the wizarding world would come to fear. Chapter 11, Vanishing into the Continent. Grindelwald did not look back as he crossed the border out of Britain. Behind him lay Godric's Hollow, the small churchyard, the cottage with its broken window, and the silence that had fallen between himself and the young man he had once called his dearest friend. Behind him too lay Ariana, still and small in the summer grass, a tragedy no one could ever fully explain, and one he refused to examine too closely. He had run because staying meant facing what had happened, and facing what had happened meant becoming someone smaller than the person he believed himself destined to be. So he ran, and the running became a kind of transformation in itself, mile by mile, port town by port town, until the boy who had charmed an entire village with his wit had become someone the villages of Europe would soon learn to fear and admire in equal measure. The early months were formless. He drifted through the Netherlands first, then down along the Rhine, sleeping in the back rooms of apothecaries and the lofts of wizarding inns that asked no questions of a traveler who paid in old coin and kept his hood raised. He told no one his true name. In some towns he called himself a scholar of ancient magic, in others a collector of rare texts, and both were true enough to pass as honest. He had always possessed a gift for language, for absorbing the shape of a place within days of arriving, and this gift served him now as armor. Nobody looked twice at a well-spoken young foreigner who spent his evenings in libraries and his mornings walking alone. It was in these quiet months that the scholar in him, the part of his mind that had once thrilled at Hogwarts to the discovery of some obscure incantation, began to harden into something else. He sought out the old libraries of continental wizarding families, the private collections tucked behind unremarkable doors in Nuremberg and Vienna and Prague, places where restricted knowledge was traded quietly among those who understood its worth. He read of the Deathly Hallows there in greater depth than any book in England had allowed him, tracing variant legends, half-remembered ballads, and fragments of older magic that hinted the objects might be more than a children's tale. Where once this had been a shared obsession, a private language between himself and Albus, it now became a solitary pursuit, and solitary pursuits, unchecked by friendship or doubt, tend to grow strange edges. He crossed into the German states, then further east, always moving, always learning. He studied under minor practitioners of magic few in Britain had ever heard of, men and women who taught him variations of transfiguration and charm work considered too dangerous or too obscure for a conventional education. He learned how magical communities in different countries organized themselves, how some clung fiercely to old customs while others had grown timid under the weight of ministries and statutes designed to keep wizardkind hidden. He began, in these years, to form opinions about what he saw, and the opinions were rarely charitable. He believed that concealment had made wizardkind small. He believed that a people capable of such power had folded themselves into hiding out of fear rather than wisdom, and that this fear had cost them the world they might otherwise have shaped for the better of everyone in it, wizard and non-wizard alike. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to brilliant young men who have lost the one person who understood them, and Grindelwald wore that loneliness like a second cloak throughout these wandering years. He wrote no letters home. He kept no correspondence with Britain at all, not even in these earliest years. With Albus, though the memory of their long conversations in Godric's Hollow, the shared dreams of a wizarding world unshackled from secrecy, never fully left him. If anything, distance sharpened those dreams rather than dulling them. Away from the person who might have argued him back toward caution, his ideas grew bolder, less tethered to consequence, more convinced of their own righteousness. By the time he reached the mountain regions further south, something in his manner had changed enough that those who met him began to notice it without being able to name it. He carried himself now with a stillness that unsettled as much as it impressed. The stillness of someone who had stopped asking whether he was right and had begun instead to plan how he would prove it. He was, by any account, still remarkably young, not yet in his mid-20s, and yet those who spoke with him described the unnerving sense of conversing with someone far older, someone who had already decided the shape of the future and was simply waiting for the world to catch up to him. He supported himself in these years through small acts of undeniable talent. He mended enchantments that local wand makers and healers could not unravel. He solved puzzles of old magic that had stumped scholars for decades, and word of this unnamed traveler with the pale hair and the quick, searching eyes began to spread quietly among those circles where such things mattered. He gave little away about himself, but what he did share, in careful measured doses, was a philosophy. He spoke, when pressed, of a wizarding world too afraid of its own strength, of ministries too content with smallness, of the immense good that could be done if such power were allowed to guide rather than hide. He never called it domination. He called it responsibility, and he called it, more and more often as the years passed, the greater good. It was not yet a movement. It was, in these vanishing years, only a handful of ideas turning over and over in one clever and grieving mind, refined night after night in rented rooms across a continent that had no idea yet what it was quietly incubating. But ideas held long enough, spoken carefully enough to the right listeners, have a way of finding root. And Grindelwald, who had once been simply a brilliant and reckless boy with a gift for charm and a hunger for greatness, was slowly becoming something the wizarding world had not seen in generations. A mind patient enough to wait, sharp enough to persuade, and wounded enough to believe that the ends he sought could justify almost anything asked in their service. He was no longer running from Godric's Hollow by the end of these years. He had stopped thinking of himself as someone in flight at all. He had begun, instead, to think of himself as someone in preparation, gathering knowledge and quiet allies the way a tide gathers strength before it turns, and somewhere in a mountain town, whose name history would later remember only in passing, the first people willing to listen closely to his words were about to find him. Up next in Chapter 12, The Rise of a Following, we will uncover how Grindelwald's private philosophy began to draw its first true believers, and how a wandering scholar with grief still folded quietly beneath his composure started to become the leader of something far larger than himself. Chapter 12, The Rise of a Following. Somewhere in a mountain town whose name history would later remember only in passing, the first people willing to listen closely to Grindelwald's words began to find him, and he them. It happened gradually, the way most transformations of consequence tend to happen, not with a single dramatic gathering, but with quiet conversations in the back rooms of taverns and libraries. One curious listener leading to another, until the wandering scholar with the pale hair and the searching eyes was no longer traveling entirely alone. The young men and women who first gathered around him were, in their own ways, as restless as he was. Some were the disillusioned children of old wizarding families who felt the weight of centuries of secrecy pressing down on lives they believed should have been grander. Others were simply gifted and unmoored, drawn to a person who spoke with such calm certainty about a future in which their talents would matter openly, rather than being folded away behind the caution of ministries and statutes of secrecy. Grindelwald had a rare talent for recognizing which kind of listener he was speaking to, and an even rarer talent for telling each of them exactly what would make his vision feel like their own idea rather than his. He did not preach in the manner of a street orator. He was too clever for that, and too aware that grand declarations shouted in public squares drew exactly the wrong kind of attention. Instead, he cultivated small circles, intimate gatherings where his philosophy could be unfolded slowly, layered with historical argument and personal charisma, until it felt less like a doctrine and more like an inevitable conclusion any intelligent person would eventually reach on their own. He spoke of the long history of wizardkind hiding its brilliance from a non-magical world it could have guided toward peace and prosperity. He spoke of wars among muggles that wizards could have prevented or ended in a single afternoon had they not been bound by fear and old treaties. He spoke, always, of the greater good, a phrase he used so often and so persuasively that those who heard it began to repeat it themselves, turning his private philosophy into something closer to scripture. Word of him spread through the loose networks that connected wizarding communities across the continent, from small enclaves in the Alps to old magical quarters in cities whose non-magical populations had no notion of what lived quietly among them. He traveled less now, choosing instead to let his following come to him. And this shift itself said something about how far he had risen from the friendless traveler of only a few years before. Where once he had needed shelter and coin from strangers, now strangers began offering both freely, hoping only for a place near him, a chance to be counted among the clever few who understood, before anyone else did, where the future of wizardkind was heading. His symbol had not yet taken its final shape in these years, nor had his methods hardened into anything resembling open conflict. This was still, in large part, a war of ideas, fought in salons and private libraries rather than open fields, and Grindelwald proved himself as skilled at this quieter kind of battle as he would later prove himself at the louder kind. He debated visiting scholars and dismantled their objections with the same effortless precision he had once used to win arguments with his old friend in the garden at Godric's Hollow. Though now there was no friend present to temper his conclusions, no one willing to push back hard enough to slow him down. It would be a mistake to imagine that everyone who encountered him in these years was drawn in. Many wizarding elders regarded him with suspicion from the very beginning, unsettled by the ease with which he moved young and talented people toward positions they might once have found unthinkable. There were murmurs, quiet ones at first, among older and more cautious magical families, that the handsome young philosopher gathering followers in the mountains was saying things that sounded less like reform and more like justification for whatever he intended to do next. But these murmurs were, for now, easy enough to dismiss, because Grindelwald had not yet done anything that could be called dangerous in the eyes of the law. He had only spoken, and speaking, however persuasive, was not yet a crime. Among his earliest and most devoted followers were young witches and wizards who would go on to carry his ideas into their own communities long after they had left his immediate circle, spreading the philosophy of the greater good the way seeds are carried on wind, taking root in places he himself would never visit. This was, in many ways, the true genius of his rise. He did not need to convert an entire continent personally. He needed only to convert enough believers who would go on to convert others, each one convinced they had arrived at their conclusions through their own reasoning rather than his careful guidance. He began, during these years, to acquire something else as valuable as followers, which was reputation. Stories about him grew more elaborate with each retelling, Some true, many exaggerated. A few invented outright by followers eager to burnish the legend of the man they had chosen to follow. He was said to have solved impossible magical theorems in a single sitting. He was said to have bent the will of skeptical elders through argument alone. He was said, in the most breathless tellings, to be preparing something far larger than any small circle of admirers, something that would change the shape of the wizarding world entirely. Grindelwald neither confirmed nor denied these stories, and his silence, more often than not, only made them grow larger. By the later years of this period, what had begun as a handful of quiet conversations in mountain taverns had become something that resembled, unmistakably, a movement. It had no formal name yet, no banner raised above it, but it had believers scattered across borders, a shared vocabulary built from Grindelwald's own carefully chosen phrases, and a leader who understood, perhaps better than anyone of his generation, how to turn private conviction into collective purpose. The wandering boy who had fled Godric's Hollow with nothing but grief and a battered reputation had, in the span of a few short years, become someone others were willing to organize their lives around. And with that following now firmly in place, the quiet phase of persuasion could not last forever. Ideas that gather enough believers eventually seek expression beyond the printed page and the private salon. And across the wizarding governments of Europe, a growing unease was beginning to stir. An uneasy awareness that the charismatic young philosopher so many were now quoting might be building towards something considerably more consequential than a philosophy. Up next in Chapter 13, A Continent on Edge, we will uncover how Grindelwald's rising influence began colliding with the wizarding authorities determined to contain him, and how an entire continent slowly came to sense the shadow gathering at its edges. Chapter 13, A Continent on Edge. Across the wizarding governments of Europe, a growing unease was beginning to stir in these years. An uneasy awareness that the charismatic young philosopher so many were now quoting might be building towards something considerably more consequential than a philosophy. And it was around this time that Grindelwald's name first began to appear, in careful and worried handwriting, in the private correspondence of ministries that had until then paid him little mind. The nature of his following had changed by this point, subtly but unmistakably. What had been small circles of admirers meeting quietly in mountain towns had grown into something with structure, with trusted lieutenants who carried his message into new territories, and with resources that no longer resembled the humble means of a wandering scholar. Wealthy sympathizers, drawn by the same arguments that had captivated poorer and more restless followers, began quietly funding his activities, offering estates for gatherings, funding the printing of pamphlets that carried his ideas further than his own voice ever could have reached alone. He had become, without ever holding any official title, a figure with genuine power, and power of that kind rarely escapes the notice of those whose job it is to preserve order. The wizarding governments of the continent were not, in these years, unified in how they viewed him. Some dismissed him as a passing fascination among the young and disaffected, the kind of radical thinker every generation produces, and every generation eventually forgets. Others, more perceptive, or simply more anxious by nature, saw in his rhetoric something with sharper edges than mere philosophy, a suggestion, made ever more openly in his later speeches, that the secrecy-binding wizard kind might need to be broken not through patient reform, but through decisive action, taken by those wise enough and strong enough to lead the rest toward a better world, whether the rest were ready for it or not. It was this shift from persuasion to something closer to intention that began to worry even some of his own early sympathizers. A few quietly distanced themselves in these years, unsettled by speeches that had once sounded like idealism, and now carried an edge of inevitability, as though Grindelwald had stopped trying to convince anyone and started simply explaining what was going to happen regardless of whether they agreed. Those who remained close to him, however, only grew more devoted, drawn by the same magnetic certainty that had first pulled them in, now amplified by his evident success and the widening reach of his name. This period of unrest in the wizarding world did not occur in isolation. Beyond the hidden borders of magical society, the non-magical world of the same era was itself sliding through its own gathering tensions, old rivalries hardening, old certainties crumbling, a restlessness in the air that touched hidden and visible societies alike, each unaware of how closely their troubles mirrored one another. Grindelwald, who had spent years studying and moving through both worlds, understood this parallel better than almost anyone, and he began to weave it into his rhetoric, suggesting that the coming storm among Muggles was itself proof of his argument, evidence that a world left ungoverned by wizarding wisdom was a world doomed to stumble blindly toward its own ruin. Ministries across the continent began, cautiously at first, to compare notes. Officials who had once regarded Grindelwald as a foreign problem, safely contained within another nation's borders, started to realize that his followers had crossed those same borders freely, that pamphlets bearing his ideas were appearing in cities that had never hosted him personally, and that the phrase he had made so central to his teaching, the greater good, was being repeated now by young witches and wizards who had never once met him, but felt, somehow, that they already understood him completely. There were attempts, during these years, at quiet intervention. Delegations were sent to observe his gatherings. Warnings were issued through informal channels, urging him to moderate his language, to draw back from the increasingly provocative suggestions creeping into his speeches. Grindelwald received these warnings, when he acknowledged them at all, with the same composed and faintly amused patience he had shown skeptical elders since his earliest days of persuasion, and those who met him during this period often came away disturbed less by anything he said outright than by the calm certainty with which he seemed to expect that history itself would eventually side with him. It was also during this period that whispers of his old connection to Britain resurfaced, though only among those with long memories and access to old records. Whispers of a brilliant boy expelled in disgrace from Hogwarts years before. Whispers of a tragedy in a small village garden that had never been fully explained. Grindelwald never spoke of these years publicly, and those closest to him learned early not to ask. Whatever grief or guilt he still carried from Godric's Hollow had long since been folded beneath the composed and commanding figure he now presented to the world. And if it surfaced at all, it surfaced only in the fierce, almost desperate conviction with which he pursued his larger vision, as though enough greatness achieved might yet outweigh whatever had been lost that summer. By the later years of this uneasy period, the pattern was becoming difficult for even the most cautious officials to ignore. Followers loyal to Grindelwald had begun establishing themselves in positions of quiet influence across several magical communities. Incidents, small but troubling, of confrontations between his sympathizers and local authorities had started to accumulate in official reports. Each one dismissed individually as an isolated matter, each one, taken together, forming the unmistakable outline of a continent slowly tightening with unease. Something was coming, and though no one could yet say precisely what shape it would take, an entire hidden world had begun, almost in spite of itself, to brace. Up next in Chapter 14, The Shadow over Europe, we will uncover how that mounting unease finally broke into open conflict, and how Grindelwald's long-gathered following became the instrument of a war that would leave its mark across the wizarding world for generations to come. Chapter 14. The Shadow over Europe. Something was coming, and though no one could yet say precisely what shape it would take, an entire hidden world had begun, almost in spite of itself, to brace. And in the years that followed, that bracing proved well-founded. For the uneasy quiet that had settled over wizarding Europe finally broke, and what emerged from it was a conflict unlike anything the magical world had witnessed in generations. It did not begin with a single dramatic battle. It began, as Grindelwald's rise always had, in small increments that only later revealed themselves as the opening movements of something far larger. Confrontations that had once been dismissed as isolated incidents grew more frequent and less easy to explain away. Communities that had resisted his influence found themselves facing pressure they could not ignore, and ministries that had hoped quiet diplomacy might contain him discovered, too late, that persuasion had run its course and something harder had taken its place. Grindelwald himself seemed, during these years, to shed the last patience he had once shown towards slower methods of change. The philosopher who had once won over skeptics through careful argument in private libraries now moved with the confidence of someone who no longer needed to convince anyone of anything, only to demonstrate what he and his followers were capable of achieving. His forces, for by this point they could rightly be called forces, moved through wizarding communities across the continent with an efficiency that spoke of careful planning built up over years of quiet preparation. Those who stood against him were met with a display of power calculated to discourage further resistance rather than provoke unnecessary conflict. For Grindelwald understood, even at the height of his ambition, that fear could accomplish what bloodshed alone could not, and he preferred, wherever possible, to let his reputation do the work his wand might otherwise have needed to do. It was during this period that he adopted the symbol that would come to be inseparable from his name in the memory of the wizarding world. A simple design of a triangle enclosing a circle, split through by a single vertical line. To most who saw it painted on walls or carved into doorframes in villages he had passed through, it appeared to be nothing more than an unsettling mark of warning, a sign that his influence had reached that place before them. Only a small circle of his closest followers, and a scattering of scholars who had studied the same obscure texts he once pored over in his wandering years, understood its true origin, a symbol drawn from ancient legend, representing three objects of immense and near-mythical power, the Deathly Hallows, the same objects that had once filled his youthful conversations with wonder rather than dread. What had begun as a private fascination shared between two brilliant young friends in a garden in Godric's Hollow had become, in his hands, the emblem of a movement that many now regarded with genuine terror. This transformation of a symbol of wonder into a symbol of warning captured something essential about what Grindelwald himself had become. He was, by every account of those who encountered him in this period, still capable of extraordinary charm, still able to speak with the same warmth and conviction that had once won over an entire village of strangers in a matter of weeks. And yet, beneath that charm now lay something far colder, a willingness to let entire communities live in fear of his name if it meant they would not think to resist him. Stories spread of villages that surrendered without confrontation simply because his symbol had appeared on a wall the night before. Stories spread, too, of those who did resist. And though such stories were rarely detailed in the histories later written of this period, out of a wish to spare those who lived through it further sorrow, it was understood by all who lived in the shadow of this conflict that resistance carried real cost. The wizarding governments of Europe, so slow to unite against him in his years of quiet persuasion, found themselves now forced into uneasy cooperation, sharing information, coordinating what defenses they could, and quietly acknowledging what many had refused to say aloud only a few years before, that the philosopher they had once hoped might simply fade from relevance had become the single greatest threat wizardkind had faced in living memory. It was a strange and unsettling truth that this widening magical conflict unfolded alongside a non-magical world sliding, in these same years, ever closer to a catastrophe of its own. The two crises moving in an uneasy parallel that few at the time fully appreciated. Each world absorbed in its own gathering darkness, each unaware how closely the shape of one echoed the other. Grindelwald made no secret, among his followers, of how he viewed this convergence. He spoke of it as further proof that the world, wizard and non-wizard alike, could not be trusted to govern itself wisely, and that the suffering unfolding beyond magical borders was precisely the kind of catastrophe his vision had always warned against. It was a persuasive argument to those already inclined to follow him, and a chilling one to those who understood how easily such reasoning could be twisted to excuse almost any action taken in its name. By the height of this period, his name alone was enough to empty streets in some corners of wizarding Europe, and enough to fill secret meeting halls with those who still believed, despite everything, that he alone possessed the vision needed to lead them somewhere better. He had become, in the span of little more than 2 decades since fleeing a quiet English village in disgrace, one of the most powerful and most feared wizards the world had ever known. And yet, for all his influence, for all the followers who would have given anything to see his ambitions realized, there remained one goal that eclipsed all the rest in his private ambitions, a goal he had carried since those early wandering years spent poring over half-forgotten texts in continental libraries. The pursuit of an object so powerful that legend itself struggled to describe its true reach. Up next, in Chapter 15, The Elder Wand's Master, we will uncover how Grindelwald's long fascination with the Deathly Hallows led him at last to seek out the most formidable wand ever forged, and how his confrontation with the wand maker who guarded it would cement his place as the most feared wizard of his age. Chapter 15. The Elder Wand's Master. Long before Grindelwald commanded followers, before his name emptied streets and filled hidden meeting halls, there had been the sign of the Deathly Hallows, the triangle, the circle, and the line, carved into a dormitory wall at Durmstrang by a brilliant and restless student who believed the old tale of the 3 brothers was not a fable at all, but a map. That belief had carried him to Godric's Hollow in his youth, to the grave of Ignotus Peverell, and to the company of another young genius who shared his hunger for the objects the story described. And though the friendship had ended in grief and a shattered summer, the belief itself had never loosened its hold on him. Through all the years of wandering, of gathering disciples, of building a movement that shook the foundations of magical Europe, the Hallows remained his most private obsession, the one pursuit he kept closest to his heart, even as his public ambitions grew vast enough to frighten governments. The cloak of invisibility had vanished into the folds of history, its trail long cold. The resurrection stone was little more than a whisper attached to a ring no one could locate. But the third hollow, the wand of legend, had never truly disappeared. It had simply kept moving. That was the strange and terrible beauty of the Elder Wand, as Grindelwald understood it better than perhaps any wizard alive. The wand's history was not a hidden one. It was a loud one, a trail of boasts and duels and sudden reversals stretching back through centuries, told under many names. Some called it the Death Stick, others called it the Wand of Destiny. In every generation there seemed to be some wizard who rose to sudden and unnatural prominence, winning duels no one believed he could win. And in every generation that wizard eventually fell to someone bolder or more cunning, and the wand passed on. Most who studied this blood-stained lineage saw a curse, an object that doomed its owners. Grindelwald, characteristically, read the same history and saw something else entirely. He saw a pattern, and patterns could be used. The wand did not destroy its masters out of malice. It simply gave its full allegiance to whoever proved stronger, and ambitious wizards, knowing this, came hunting. The danger was not in the wand. The danger was in being known to hold it while lacking the power to keep it. Buried inside that pattern was the detail that would shape everything he did next. A piece of wand lore so simple that generations of murderers had overlooked it. The Elder Wand did not demand the death of its previous owner. It demanded only defeat. Allegiance passed at the moment one wizard overcame another, whether by killing curse or by disarming charm or by any act that left the former master bested. The trail of corpses that followed the wand through history was a record of habit, not of necessity. Wizards had killed for it because killing was the surest way they knew to end a rivalry, not because the wand required blood. Grindelwald grasped this distinction with the clarity that made him so formidable, and it meant that when his chance came, he would not need to arrive as an executioner. He would only need to arrive as a thief with perfect timing, take the wand into his hand, and defeat its keeper on the way out. Victory, however brief, however bloodless, would be enough. The wand would feel its allegiance turn the way a compass needle swings toward north, without ceremony and without appeal. The chance itself came in the form of a rumor, drifting westward out of Eastern Europe like smoke from a distant fire. Wizards spoke of a wand maker, one of the most gifted craftsmen on the continent, a rival in reputation to Ollivander himself, whose workshop produced wands of unusual power. His name was Gregorovitch, and the whisper attached to his name was this: that Gregorovitch had come into possession of a wand unlike any other, an ancient thing of elder wood, and that he was studying it, testing it, attempting to unravel the secrets of its construction so that he might duplicate its powers in wands of his own making. It was, from a craftsman's point of view, an entirely understandable ambition. A wand maker who could reproduce the qualities of the most formidable wand ever created would stand alone in his trade for a century. And so Gregorovitch, perhaps unable to resist the value of the claim, allowed word of his prize to circulate, believing the rumor would bring customers to his door. He did not fully reckon with what else a rumor can bring. A rumor travels to every ear equally, and somewhere among all the ears of Europe were two pale, mismatched eyes that had been searching for exactly this news for the better part of a lifetime. Grindelwald did not strike at once. That was never his way when something mattered to him. He gathered every thread of the story, weighed the boasts against the geography, traced the accounts back toward their source, and satisfied himself that behind the exaggerations there was a hard kernel of truth, a real wand of elder wood sitting in a real workshop behind the locked doors of a real house. Then, he studied the house. He learned its rhythms, the hours when the lamps went dark, the habits of the man who slept above his own workbench, surrounded by the tools of his trade. Gregorovitch was no fool and no weakling. He was a master of a subtle branch of magic, protected by his own enchantments, and a direct assault might have ended badly or loudly, or both. But Grindelwald had no intention of announcing himself. The beauty of the wand lore he understood so well was that stealth and victory could be the same act. He needed only to hold the wand and to leave its owner defeated behind him. And the oldest and most dangerous object in wizarding history would be his by every law that governed it. The night he chose was an ordinary one, which was precisely the point. Inside the darkened building, The wand-maker slept while the object of a lifetime's searching rested somewhere among his workrooms, and through that darkness, a golden-haired figure climbed to an upper window and settled onto the ledge outside it, perched on the sill like some improbable bird, in no apparent hurry at all. What woke Gregorovitch, whether a sound from below or the instinct of a man who knows the value of what he guards, hardly matters. He rose, he lit his lamp, and he hurried up through his own house toward the room where the wand was kept, and there, framed in the window against the night sky, he saw the intruder, young in the face, with a tumble of golden hair and an expression of pure delight, as though the entire evening were a joke being told for his private amusement. The stolen wand was already in the thief's hand. Gregorovitch shouted and lunged, and the figure on the window ledge laughed, a merry, ringing laugh that would echo in the wandmaker's memory for the rest of his life, and then, in a single unhurried motion, sent a stunning spell across the room. Scarlet light filled the workshop. Gregorovitch dropped where he stood, bested in his own home by a spell he never had the chance to answer, and the laughing figure leapt backward from the sill into the dark and was gone. It is a scene worth holding in the mind for a moment, because it would not remain locked in Gregorovitch's memory forever. Decades later, another dark wizard, hunting the same wand along the same trail, would tear this very recollection from the old wand-maker's mind. And through that stolen memory, a boy named Harry Potter would one day watch the golden-haired thief perch on the windowsill and laugh and vanish into the night, and would come to understand, piece by piece, whose young face he had seen. But all of that lay far in the future. On the night itself there was only a ransacked workroom, an unconscious craftsman, and a rumor that would soon curdle into legend. The story of the man who robbed Gregorovitch and left him alive to wonder why. Alive was the extraordinary part, and it was no accident and no mercy in the ordinary sense. Grindelwald had taken the Elder Wand exactly as his understanding of its nature demanded. He had entered as its owner slept, claimed it, and defeated that owner face to face on his way out the window. The stunning spell had done everything a killing curse could have done, and more, for it left behind a living witness to the humiliation, and humiliation, in the strange arithmetic of wandlore, was sufficient. From the instant Gregorovitch crumpled to his workshop floor, the most powerful wand in existence answered to Gellert Grindelwald and to no one else. He had beaten the pattern that had destroyed so many of the wand's masters before him, slipping into the bloody lineage of the Deathstick through a side door, without adding a single death to its history. There was something almost scholarly in the elegance of it, the great revolutionary proving that he had read the old stories more carefully than anyone, and that the deepest magic yields not to force alone, but to the one who truly understands its rules. What followed confirmed everything the legends had ever promised. With the Elder Wand in his hand, Grindelwald's duels ceased to be contests in any meaningful sense. Witnesses spoke of shield charms folding like parchment, of curses turned aside before they were fully formed, of a wizard who fought as though the outcome had been decided before the first spell was cast. His military position across Europe hardened from strength into something closer to inevitability. Fortresses that might once have resisted him opened their gates rather than test him. Aurors who had trained for years to face dark wizards found their nerve deserting them at the mere confirmation that the wand of legend was real and was his. And among his followers, the effect was greater than any victory in the field. For the man who had preached that he was destined to remake the world now carried the proof of that destiny in his hand. The sign he had worn since his school days, the triangle enclosing circle and line, was no longer merely an emblem. 1/3 of it had come true. The Hallows were not a story. They could be found, they could be won, and their master walked among his disciples, wearing history itself like a cloak across his shoulders. Yet even in the flush of this triumph, the world beyond his movement was slower to understand what had happened in that Eastern European workshop. Governments received fragmentary reports. Wandmakers exchanged uneasy letters. Ordinary witches and wizards heard tenth-hand versions of the robbery and struggled to separate truth from terror. The theft of the Elder Wand was, in its own hushed way, one of the pivotal events of the age, and it had taken place in a single minute of scarlet light and laughter, witnessed by exactly one man who woke hours later on his workshop floor with nothing left to guard. The continent would spend years catching up to the meaning of that minute, and by the time it did, Grindelwald's shadow would stretch from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Up next, in Chapter 16, The World Watches, we will uncover how news of the wand's capture spread across a continent that was only beginning to understand what Grindelwald had become, and how the watching world, from frightened villages to the halls of the International Confederation of Wizards, struggled to decide what could possibly be done about a wizard who now seemed to hold destiny itself in his hand. With Gregorovitch defeated and the Elder Wand resting at last in his hand, Grindelwald stood, in the eyes of the wizarding world, as something closer to a force of nature than a man. And it is to that widening world, watching him with a mixture of dread and disbelief, that we now turn in a chapter we might call The World Watches. News of the Elder Wand's capture spread faster than any owl could carry it, passed from wizard to witch in hurried whispers at market stalls, in the back rooms of apothecaries, in the drawing rooms of old wizarding families who had once believed themselves untouchable. The tale of the wandmaker Gregorovitch, bested in his own workshop, took on the shape of legend within weeks, and legend, as it so often does, grew larger and stranger with every retelling. Some said Grindelwald had not needed to lift a finger, that the wand itself had leapt into his palm the moment he crossed the threshold. Others insisted the duel had lasted through an entire night, that the walls of the workshop still bore the scars of a battle no ordinary wizard could have survived. The truth mattered less, by that point, than the feeling the story left behind, a feeling that spread through wizarding Europe like frost creeping across a windowpane, slow, certain, and impossible to wipe away once it had taken hold. It was against this backdrop that the International Confederation of Wizards, the Great Assembly meant to speak for magical governments across the globe, found itself facing a test unlike any in its long history. The Confederation had been built for slower, gentler business, for the quiet arbitration of disputes between ministries, for the careful management of international magical law. It had never truly been built for a man like Grindelwald, a man who moved faster than its committees could convene, who struck in one country while delegates were still debating what had happened in another. Meetings ran long into the night in the Confederation's chambers, delegates from a dozen nations arguing over the proper response, some urging immediate and unified action, others cautious of provoking a wizard whose power seemed to grow with every passing season. Resolutions were drafted and redrafted. Statements of condemnation were issued, worded carefully, diplomatically, and to those living under the shadow of Grindelwald's growing reach, achingly slow to arrive and thin of any real weight. Meanwhile, the toll of his campaign continued its steady climb. Villages that had once been marked only by their remoteness and their peace found themselves swept into his reach, their resistance, where it existed at all, crushed within days. Ministries that tried to hold their ground discovered that Grindelwald's followers were rarely acting alone, that fear itself had become one of his most reliable weapons, spreading ahead of his armies and softening the will of those who might otherwise have stood firm. Families across wizarding Europe began to speak in lowered voices of relatives who had vanished, of entire communities that had gone quiet, of owls that no longer returned. It became common, in those years, for households to keep their curtains drawn even in daylight, for children to be taught the quickest routes to a hidden cellar or a warded attic, for the comforting rhythms of ordinary magical life, market days and Quidditch matches and quiet evenings by the fire, to be lived under a kind of watchfulness that had not existed before. The atmosphere that settled over the wizarding world in those years was not one of open panic, for panic, in its way, would have been easier to bear, being loud and visible and possible to name. What spread instead was something quieter and more corrosive, a low hum of dread that never quite left the back of the mind, a sense that safety itself had become provisional, granted only until Grindelwald's attention happened to turn elsewhere. Wizarding families who had lived for generations without a single thought of leaving their homes began to draw up plans of where they might go if the need arose. Shopkeepers kept half an ear on the news from neighboring countries, even as they served their customers. It was, in the truest sense, a continent holding its breath, waiting to see who would finally step forward to answer a threat that words and resolutions alone could never hope to contain. And it was into this waiting, this heavy and unanswered silence, that one name kept rising, spoken first in careful murmurs and then, as the months wore on, with growing insistence. Albus Dumbledore, by then a respected and gifted professor at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, had long been recognized as one of the most formidable wizards of his generation. A scholar whose achievements in transfiguration and alchemy had already earned him a reputation stretching well beyond the walls of the castle where he taught. To many who watched the growing catastrophe unfolding across the continent, the solution seemed almost painfully obvious. Here was a wizard of extraordinary power and extraordinary insight, one who, according to old rumor, had once known Grindelwald personally, had once walked beside him through the quiet lanes of a small English village in a summer that felt now like it belonged to another lifetime entirely. Surely, the reasoning went, such a man was uniquely suited, perhaps uniquely destined, to be the one who finally stood against him. Yet Dumbledore did not step forward. Season after season passed, and while other wizards rallied, formed resistance networks, smuggled families across borders, and took up wands in defense of their homes, Dumbledore remained at Hogwarts, teaching his classes, tending his garden, offering quiet counsel to students and colleagues, but never once making a public move against the wizard whose name had become synonymous with fear itself. His reluctance seemed almost inexplicable, even to the harsher critics among them. A kind of quiet cowardice, unbecoming of a wizard so gifted. Letters arrived at Hogwarts with increasing frequency, some pleading, some furious, urging him to act, to lead, to do what so many believed only he could do. He answered few of them, and those he did answer gave little away, offering only careful, measured words that satisfied no one and explained nothing. What none of those correspondents could have known, what remained buried deep beneath the calm and courteous exterior Dumbledore presented to the world, was the true and tangled history that bound him to Gellert Grindelwald, a history that reached back decades to a garden in Godric's Hollow, to a friendship once so bright it had nearly reshaped both of their futures, and to a tragedy neither man had ever fully laid to rest. It was not, as his harshest critics assumed, an absence of courage that kept Dumbledore from stepping into the fight. It was something far heavier, something he had carried in silence for the better part of his adult life, a fear that had nothing to do with losing and everything to do with what facing his old friend again might finally force into the light. Up next in Chapter 17, The Letter Never Sent, we will uncover how that old and unhealed history came to weigh so heavily on Albus Dumbledore, and what it truly was that kept him, for so long, from lifting his wand against the man he had once loved as a brother. Long before the world had begun asking why Albus Dumbledore would not move against Gellert Grindelwald, Dumbledore himself had been asking that same question in the privacy of his own mind, and it is into that private, unresolved struggle that we now step, in a chapter we might call The Letter Never Sent. In the quiet hours after his classes had ended and the corridors of Hogwarts had emptied of students, Dumbledore often sat alone in his study, a parchment before him, a quill resting in his hand, and no words willing to come. He had begun that letter more times than he could easily count, addressed sometimes formally, sometimes with the old familiarity of their youth. And each time the words dried up somewhere around the second line, leaving him staring at a half-finished sentence until the candle beside him burned low. It was not, as one might expect, a lack of things to say. It was, instead, an overabundance of things he did not know how to say, feelings so tangled together that pulling on any single thread threatened to unravel the careful composure he had spent decades constructing around himself. To understand the weight of that silence, one has to return, if only briefly, to the summer that had shaped both young men so profoundly. The summer in Godric's Hollow, when Albus and Gellert had been nothing more than two brilliant young minds delighting in each other's company, dreaming aloud of a world reshaped by wizards bold enough to claim their rightful place above the ordinary constraints of secrecy and caution. That friendship, and the grand ambitions it had kindled, had ended in a manner neither of them could undo. A duel in a garden that had grown suddenly and irrevocably violent, and the death of someone dear to them both. In the years since, Dumbledore had rarely spoken of that summer to anyone, and those who worked alongside him at Hogwarts knew only the barest outline of a painful chapter from his youth, never the full and aching shape of it. What haunted Dumbledore now was not simply the memory of what had happened, but the fear of what a confrontation with Grindelwald might force back into the open. He understood, better than anyone alive, that facing his old friend in battle would mean facing, too, everything left unspoken between them. The affection that had once burned so brightly it had blinded him to danger. The guilt he carried for a loss he had never allowed himself to properly grieve, and the terrible, private uncertainty of a truth he had never spoken aloud to another living soul. He feared, more than he feared any curse Grindelwald might cast, that the duel itself might unearth the full and painful truth of that final night in the garden, a truth that touched on matters far too tender and far too sorrowful to examine beneath the eyes of a watching world. There was also, beneath the guilt, something quieter and perhaps even harder to admit, a lingering thread of the old fondness that had once bound the two of them together. Dumbledore was not a man given to easy sentiment, but those who knew him best in later years would come to understand that some part of him had never fully released the young man he had once known. The brilliant, restless dreamer who had arrived in Godric's Hollow full of ideas and hunger and charm. It is a difficult thing, even for the wisest among us, to reconcile the person we loved with the person the world now begged us to destroy. And Dumbledore, for all his formidable gifts, found himself caught in exactly that difficulty, turning it over and over in the quiet hours of the night without ever quite arriving at peace. Meanwhile, the pressure from beyond his study walls only continued to mount. Colleagues at the Ministry of Magic sent increasingly urgent correspondence. Former students, now grown and frightened for their own families scattered across the continent, wrote to their old professor asking, sometimes gently and sometimes with barely restrained desperation, why the one wizard rumored to be Grindelwald's equal had not yet raised his wand in their defense. Even within the walls of Hogwarts, a certain uneasy silence settled around Dumbledore whenever Grindelwald's name arose in conversation. Colleagues glancing his way and then quickly looking elsewhere, as though sensing a wound too raw to prod. He bore all of this with his usual composed and courteous manner, offering measured reassurances that satisfied no one, least of all himself. It was during this long season of hesitation that Dumbledore's younger brother, Aberforth, made his own feelings known in the plainer, blunter fashion that had always characterized him. Aberforth had never shared his brother's fascination with Grindelwald, had in fact been the one to see, long before Albus, the danger coiled beneath that magnetic charm. And the years since had done nothing to soften his judgment. Whatever words passed between the two brothers in those difficult months were never recorded for history. But those who caught even fragments of their exchanges came away with the unmistakable sense that old wounds, never properly closed, were being reopened. That the tragedy in the garden still stood between them exactly as it had the day it happened, unhealed and unspoken. Through it all, the letter to Grindelwald remained unfinished, folded away in a drawer or fed at last to the fire, only for a fresh sheet of parchment to be. Dumbledore was not a man who lacked courage, not in the sense the wider wizarding world understood courage, the willingness to face danger, to stand and fight when the moment demanded it. His hesitation ran deeper than fear of losing a duel. It was the fear of what winning, or even simply beginning, might cost him in truths he had spent a lifetime trying not to examine too closely. And yet, even as he wrestled with all of this in private, the world beyond his study windows grew darker by the season. The toll of Grindelwald's ambitions climbing higher. The plea for someone, anyone, to intervene growing louder with each passing month, until the question was no longer whether Dumbledore would act, but how much more the wizarding world would be made to endure while he continued to hesitate. Far to the east, in those same difficult years, Grindelwald himself was turning his considerable will toward a new and lasting monument to his power. A fortress that would come to embody everything his growing empire had become. And it is to the rising of that fortress, and to the strange, buried irony carved into its very stones, that our story must now turn. Up next in Chapter 18, Nurmengard, we will uncover how Gellert Grindelwald built a prison meant to hold his enemies forever, and the quiet, unnoticed truth of what that fortress would ultimately come to mean for the man who built it. While Albus Dumbledore sat in the candlelit stillness of his study, wrestling with a letter he could not bring himself to finish, Gellert Grindelwald was occupied with a very different kind of labor, one carved not from parchment and ink, but from stone and iron. And it is to that vast undertaking that we now turn, in a chapter we might call Nurmengard. High in a remote and forbidding stretch of mountainous terrain, in a location that Grindelwald guarded as jealously as any secret he had ever kept, work began on what would become the single most enduring monument to his rule. A fortress unlike anything the wizarding world had seen constructed in living memory. It rose slowly at first, its lowest stones laid under cover of concealment charms so thorough that even wizards traveling within sight of the mountain sensed nothing but an ordinary, unremarkable peak. But as the months passed, the structure grew taller, sturdier, and more absolute in its purpose, until it stood as a great vertical tower of dark stone, its narrow windows offering only the barest suggestion of the world outside, its walls layered with enchantments meant to make escape from within as close to impossible as magic could achieve. Grindelwald named it Nurmengard, and he declared, in the proclamations that accompanied its completion, that it would serve as the resting place for those who stood against him. The purpose of the fortress was never disguised or softened for public consumption. Nurmengard was built to be a prison, and specifically a prison for Grindelwald's enemies, for the wizards and witches across Europe who had dared to resist his growing authority, who had organized against him, spoken against him, or simply refused to bend to the new order he sought to impose. As his campaigns continued to spread across the continent, those who opposed him and were captured rather than killed found themselves delivered, sooner or later, to Nurmengard's gates, passing through wards so dense and so carefully layered that even the most gifted escape artists among them found no seam, no weakness, no forgotten gap through which freedom might be reclaimed. Families of the imprisoned rarely received word of their loved ones again. The fortress became, in the hushed conversations of those still free, a kind of dark horizon line, a place spoken of only in lowered voices, as though naming it too loudly might draw its attention. It was above the entrance to this very fortress that Grindelwald ordered a phrase carved into the stone itself, a motto meant to justify, in his own mind at least, everything the tower represented. For the greater good, the inscription read the very words that had once passed between two idealistic young men in a garden in Godric's Hollow. Words that had begun, all those years before, as a dream of a gentler, wiser world where wizards might guide and protect rather than dominate. Somewhere across the long, hardening years of war and conquest, that phrase had been stripped of its original tenderness and repurposed as justification for a prison built to silence dissent. It is one of the quieter tragedies of Grindelwald's story that a phrase born from genuine, if misguided, hope should come to be carved above a doorway built for confinement and control. A transformation that speaks, in its own way, to how far the boy from that garden had traveled from the ideals he once believed he was serving. The construction and operation of Nurmengard marked, in many respects, the very peak of Grindelwald's power. By the time its towers stood complete against the mountain sky, his influence stretched across a significant portion of magical Europe, his name spoken with a mixture of awe and dread in every wizarding household, from the coldest northern villages to the sunlit towns of the south. Ministries that had once stood independently now operated under arrangements shaped, directly or indirectly, by his growing reach. Wizards who might once have spoken openly against him now measured their words with care, uncertain who among their neighbors might carry tales back to his followers. It was, by any honest measure, the height of his tyranny, a moment when it must have seemed to Grindelwald himself, and perhaps to much of the wizarding world besides, that his vision of dominance had become simply the way things were, unshakable and permanent. And yet there is a strange and persistent thread running through even the grandest ambitions, a thread that history seems fond of weaving without the knowledge of those living through it. Nurmengard had been designed, in every stone and every ward, as a monument to Grindelwald's absolute control, a place built to hold the powerless at the mercy of the powerful. What Grindelwald could not have known, standing before his completed fortress and surveying the reach of his growing empire, was how closely that very design would one day turn back upon its architect, how the walls raised to contain his enemies carried within them a kind of quiet foreshadowing that not even his considerable foresight had detected. Some structures, it seems, are built with a symmetry their builders never intend and rarely live to recognize, and Nurmengard, tall and dark against its mountain sky, held such a symmetry folded silently within its stones, waiting for a day still years away. For now, though, Grindelwald's dominance appeared complete, his fortress standing as proof of a will that had, by every visible measure, triumphed over every obstacle placed before it. But dominance of that scale rarely goes forever unanswered, and even as Nurmengard's shadow lengthened across the mountainside, The long hesitation that had kept Albus Dumbledore from acting was, at last, beginning to give way. The pressure of the wider wizarding world, the mounting toll of Grindelwald's campaigns, and something quieter and more personal stirring within Dumbledore himself were drawing the two old friends, however reluctantly, back toward one another, toward a reckoning that had been delayed for far too long. Up next, in Chapter 19, The Duel of the Age, we will uncover how these two extraordinary wizards, bound by a friendship neither had ever fully released, finally came to stand across from one another in what would become the most storied duel of the century. With Nurmengard standing as the dark crown of his empire, and the wizarding world holding its breath under the long shadow of his rule. The moment that history had been quietly building toward for decades finally arrived, and it is to that moment that we now turn, in a chapter we might call The Duel of the Age. By the year 1945, the pressure that had gathered around Albus Dumbledore for so long had grown too great and too urgent to be held back any further. The toll of Grindelwald's campaigns had climbed past any figure the wizarding world could comfortably absorb, and the quiet hope that someone, somewhere, might yet rise to challenge him had narrowed, season by season, down to a single name. Whatever private reckoning Dumbledore had made with the memories that had held him back for so long, whatever peace or resolve he had finally found in the solitude of his study, he set out at last from Hogwarts toward the place where Grindelwald could be found, carrying with him not only his own formidable skill, but the accumulated hope of a continent that had waited far too long for this reckoning to come. Word of the coming confrontation moved through wizarding Europe with the particular hush reserved for moments people sense, long before they are told, will be remembered for generations. There is no full and certain record of exactly how word first spread, but spread it did, and by the time the two wizards stood at last within sight of one another, it seemed as though the very air itself had grown still in anticipation, as though the wind had paused its usual wandering to watch. The exact setting of the duel has been described in many differing accounts over the years, some placing it upon a windswept hillside, others within sight of Nurmengard's own dark towers. But every version agrees on one detail above all others, that the two men who finally faced each other that day had once been the closest of friends, and that neither approached the encounter with anything resembling triumph or relish. What followed has since become one of the most retold events in the whole of wizarding history, spoken of in hushed reverence in classrooms and history books alike, though those who study it most closely have always noted how little of the retelling captures the strange quiet at its center. This was not a chaotic, sprawling battle of the kind often imagined when history speaks of legendary duels. Those who have pieced together the fragments of that day describe something closer to a slow and terrible dance. Two wizards of extraordinary and nearly matched skill moving through spell after spell with the kind of controlled, deliberate precision that comes only from minds working at their absolute sharpest. Light bloomed and faded across the open air in colors few witnesses could later agree upon, arcs of magic passing so close to one another that observers at a distance later swore the sky itself seemed to shimmer and bend around the two combatants. Neither wizard wasted a single motion. Neither spoke more than the bare minimum required to cast. It was less a clash of fury than a conversation carried out in the oldest and most dangerous language either of them knew. Each exchange a question and an answer, each answer sharper and more searching than the one before it. For a long while, accounts suggest, the contest hung in a delicate and exhausting balance, each wizard meeting the other's every advance with an answer of equal weight. The duel stretching onward with a kind of terrible patience that left those few who witnessed it certain they were watching something that would never be repeated in their lifetimes. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over even the most intense of struggles when both participants understand, on some level beneath conscious thought, exactly what and who they are fighting. And those who have studied the accounts closely often note that stillness threading through every description that survives, a duel fought not in blind rage, but in something far heavier, a sorrow neither man allowed to slow his hand. In the end, it was Albus Dumbledore who proved the equal the wizarding world had so long hoped he would be. Whatever combination of skill, resolve, and hard-won clarity he carried into that final exchange, it was enough to turn the balance decisively in his favor. And Gellert Grindelwald, the wizard who had marched across a continent and built a fortress meant to hold anyone who dared oppose him, found himself at last disarmed and defeated. The Elder Wand, the very instrument of so much of his power and his legend, passed in that moment from Grindelwald's hand into Dumbledore's keeping, its allegiance shifting in the way such ancient and temperamental magic is said to shift, drawn always toward whichever wizard proves themselves its master through victory rather than mere possession. It was a quiet, almost solemn transfer, utterly unlike the thunder and spectacle that had defined the duel leading up to it, as though even the wand itself understood the weight of what had just occurred between two men who had once loved each other as brothers. News of Grindelwald's defeat spread across wizarding Europe with a speed that mirrored and in many ways surpassed the speed with which news of his earlier triumphs had once traveled. For those who had spent years in hiding, in fear, in mourning for what his campaigns had taken from them, the relief that followed was profound, though even in that relief there lingered something quieter and more complicated, an awareness that the story now closing had never been a simple one of villain and hero, but something far more tangled, rooted in a friendship that had once burned bright with genuine hope before it curdled into tragedy and war. Dumbledore himself, in the years that followed, spoke rarely and reluctantly of that day, and those who knew him best sensed that whatever victory he had won on that quiet hillside had cost him something no one else could fully measure or understand. For Grindelwald, defeat meant the end of his long and turbulent reign, but it did not mean the end of his story. For the very fortress he had built to hold his enemies now stood waiting, its dark stone walls and its narrow windows ready to receive the one prisoner its architect had never imagined he would one day become. Up next in Chapter 20, The Prisoner of His Own Tower, we will uncover how Gellert Grindelwald spent the long remainder of his life within the very walls he had raised, and what, after decades of silence, he ultimately chose to do in the final chapter of his extraordinary and complicated life. Chapter 20. The Prisoner of His Own Tower. There is a particular kind of irony that history seems to reserve for those who build monuments to their own certainty, and few examples of it have ever been as complete or as strangely fitting as the fate that awaited Gellert Grindelwald in the years after his defeat. The fortress of Nurmengard had been razed at the height of his power as a declaration in dark stone, a prison designed to hold every wizard and witch who dared to stand against his vision of the world. Its walls layered with protective enchantments of his own devising, its single towering spire visible for miles across the mountains that surrounded it. Above its entrance, carved deep into the rock by his own instruction, ran the phrase that had carried him from a schoolboy's notebook to the command of a continent, the words, "for the greater good," set there so that every prisoner who passed beneath them would understand exactly whose vision had swallowed their freedom. And it was beneath those same carved words, in the year 1945, that Grindelwald himself was led, disarmed and defeated, to become the last and longest resident of the prison he had built for everyone else. The wizarding authorities of Europe gathering in the aftermath of the great duel to decide what should be done with the most dangerous dark wizard the world had yet known, arrived at a conclusion that felt to many like a kind of poetic justice too perfect to have been invented. No prison in Britain or on the continent was considered strong enough to hold him, no cell secure enough, except the one fortress that had been designed by the sharpest and most inventive magical mind of the age to be inescapable. Nurmengard had been built to hold Grindelwald's enemies, and so Nurmengard would hold Grindelwald, its own defenses turned inward upon their maker. Every enchantment he had woven to keep others in, now serving to keep him from ever getting out. The great doors closed behind him, the wards sealed, and the man who had once commanded armies and redrawn the map of wizarding Europe was escorted up the long spiral of stairs to a single room at the very top of the tallest tower. That topmost cell would be his entire world for the remainder of his life. The accounts that survive describe a bare and narrow space, furnished with nothing more than a thin pallet of straw and a single high window, through which a man might watch the seasons turn across the mountains without ever once touching them. For a wizard who had spent his whole existence in motion, crossing borders, gathering followers, bending nations toward his will, the sheer smallness of that room must have been a sentence in itself, more confining than any chain. And yet it was there, in that room, that Gellert Grindelwald would live for 53 years, from his defeat in 1945 until his death in 1998, a span of time longer than his entire life up to the moment of his capture, longer than his rise and reign combined, decade after decade of the same walls, the same window, the same slow procession of light across the same worn floor. It is worth pausing over the length of that imprisonment, because numbers alone can slide past the mind without leaving their true weight behind. 53 years is time enough for a newborn child to grow up, grow old in the way of the working world, and watch children of their own reach adulthood. It is time enough for every follower Grindelwald had ever commanded to age and scatter and die, for the acolytes who had once chanted his name to fade into obscurity or repentance, for the world he had tried to conquer to rebuild itself so thoroughly that entire generations came of age knowing his name only from the pages of history books. Beyond his window, wizarding Europe healed and changed. New ministries rose, new treaties were signed, and in a distant island nation, another dark wizard began his own terrible ascent. A man who would borrow much from Grindelwald's methods while sharing none of his ideals, and whose rise and fall and rise again all took place while the old prisoner of Nurmengard watched the mountains and grew slowly ancient in his tower. What happens to such a man in such a place, across such an ocean of years, is a question that fascinated Albus Dumbledore for the rest of his own long life. And it is largely through Dumbledore's reflections that we glimpse anything of Grindelwald's inner world during those decades. Dumbledore, who understood his old friend more deeply than any living person, came to believe in his later years that something had shifted inside the prisoner of Nurmengard, that the man who had once justified every cruelty with the promise of a greater good had been left alone with his memories long enough to see them differently. Remorse, Dumbledore suggested, may have found Grindelwald at last, arriving late, as it so often does, long after it could undo anything, but arriving nonetheless. It is an extraordinary thought that the great revolutionary of the age, stripped of his wand, his armies, and his audience, might have spent his final decades in something resembling honest reckoning, turning over the faces of Godric's Hollow and the ruins of his campaigns, measuring at last the true distance between the world he had promised and the suffering he had actually delivered. We cannot know for certain, of course. Grindelwald left no confession, wrote no memoir, granted no interviews from his high window. Some historians have argued that Dumbledore's belief in his old friend's remorse says as much about Dumbledore as it does about Grindelwald. That a man who had loved once and lost terribly might need to believe that the person he had loved was capable, in the end, of regret. But there is one piece of evidence, one final act recorded at the very close of Grindelwald's life that lends real weight to Dumbledore's hope, and it arrived in the shape of the most feared wizard of the New Age, climbing the stairs of Nurmengard more than half a century after its builder had been locked inside. In the year 1998, Lord Voldemort came to Nurmengard. He came in pursuit of the Elder Wand, the same death stick that Grindelwald had stolen from the wand maker Gregorovitch so many decades before. The wand that had passed to Dumbledore on that hillside in 1945 and had been buried, or so the world believed, with Dumbledore himself. Voldemort had traced the wand's long history backward through rumor and legend and the memories of those he questioned, and that trail had led him at last to the mountains, to the tower, to the topmost cell where the wand's most famous former master lay waiting. He expected, no doubt, to find a broken old man who would surrender whatever knowledge he possessed at the first touch of fear. What he found instead was something that seems to have genuinely unsettled him. The Grindelwald of 1998 was a figure worn down to almost nothing by time. A skeletal old man with a toothless face and a body as frail as paper, lying in the dark of the cell that had held him for longer than his visitor had been alive. And yet, when Voldemort demanded to know the whereabouts of the Elder Wand, this fragile remnant of the old century did not cower, and did not bargain, and did not beg. The accounts of that meeting describe an old man who laughed in the face of the most terrifying wizard of his era, who spoke to Voldemort with open mockery and something close to pity, and who refused, plainly and finally, to give him what he wanted. Grindelwald told his visitor nothing of use. He would not say where the wand had gone, would not smooth the path toward it, and some who have studied that night believe he was doing far more than withholding a fact, that he was deliberately shielding the tomb of Albus Dumbledore from desecration, protecting in death the friend he had wronged in life, and denying Voldemort the wand in the faint hope that its terrible lineage might finally end. Dumbledore himself, speaking of these events in a conversation beyond the reach of ordinary life, expressed the belief that this was precisely what his old friend had intended, that Grindelwald in his final years had felt the weight of what he had done, and that his last act was one of defiance offered not for glory but for atonement. Whether or not the old prisoner expected mercy for his refusal, he surely knew he would not receive it. Voldemort, enraged by laughter where he had expected terror, ended the life of Gellert Grindelwald in that high cell, and the oldest and most infamous prisoner of Nurmengard died in the same room where he had spent more than half his years, killed by a wizard who had learned all of his ambition and none of his capacity for regret. It was, in its way, a peaceful conclusion despite its violence, for the man who died that night had long since finished his business with the world, and he left it holding fast to the one secret he had chosen, at the last, to keep. And so ended one of the most extraordinary and most troubling lives in the history of the wizarding world. The boy who had filled the margins of his school books at Durmstrang with dreams too large for any classroom. The young man who had stood in a summer garden with Albus Dumbledore and sketched a new order for all of humanity. The conqueror who had raised armies and toppled ministries and built a fortress to hold everyone who disagreed with him, finished his journey as an old man in a bare room, defying a tyrant with nothing left in his hands but the truth. History has never fully decided what to make of him. He was not a monster in the simple way that Voldemort was a monster, for he had begun with ideals, however twisted they became, and he seems to have ended with something that looked very much like conscience. Nor was he ever innocent, for the graves his revolution filled were real, and no late regret could empty them. He remains instead one of those rare figures who force history to hold two truths at once, that a person can cause immeasurable harm, and that the capacity for change can survive even in the darkest of lives, buried but not extinguished, waiting through 53 years of solitude for one final chance to express itself. Perhaps that is the thought to carry away from the long story of Gellert Grindelwald as it settles now into its ending. Every life, even one as vast and damaging as his, narrows eventually to a single room and a handful of choices, and what remains at the very end is not the armies or the slogans or the carved mottos above great doors, but the last thing a person decides to protect. Grindelwald, who had taken so much from the world, chose in his final moments to give one thing back: a secret kept, a tomb defended, a friendship honored half a century too late. The tower that held him stands in memory as a lesson written in stone, that the prisons we build for others have a way of becoming our own, and that, even so, no tower is ever entirely without its window. Beyond his window, the mountains kept their ancient watch, the snows came and melted and came again, and the world he had once tried to seize went on without him, imperfect and unconquered and free. And with his story told in full, from the first spark of a restless boy to the final piece of an old man who had at last stopped running from his own reflection, there is nothing left now but to rest, to breathe slowly, and to let the whole long tale drift together toward its close. And so the story comes to its quiet close. A boy at Durmstrang with quick hands and a restless mind. A schoolroom full of forbidden books. A friendship struck like a match in the garden of Godric's Hollow. Two brilliant young men dreaming of a world remade. A summer that ended in tragedy neither of them could undo. A flight across the continent, and the slow hardening of a dreamer into a conqueror. A war that spread like smoke over wizarding Europe. A wand won from a frightened craftsman. A fortress built to hold his enemies and reshaped, in the end, to hold only himself. A duel on a quiet hilltop in 1945, two old friends facing each other one final time. Decades of silence behind Nurmengard's walls, and a final, unexpected act of quiet defiance at the very end, when an old man chose truth over fear. From ambition to isolation, from brilliance to regret, Gellert Grindelwald's story reminds us that even the most dazzling minds can be led astray by the promise of greatness, and that redemption, however small, however late, is still possible. It is a story about friendship and its cost, about power and its price, and about the long, slow work of finding one's way back to something like peace. If you have followed him down every step of that road tonight, from the snowy towers of Durmstrang to the quiet stones of Nurmengard, then you have walked the whole of it with him. Wherever you are, whatever tower or cottage or quiet room you rest in tonight, let this story settle over you like a blanket, and let your thoughts grow soft and still. Good night. What did you think of this journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this changed your perspective or taught you something new, consider subscribing for more mind-expanding content. And if you know someone who would find this as fascinating as you did, share it with them. These are the kind of conversations that matter.